Chapter 315. Many people did not care. Eastern Chu's army can't do anything to us. What can a few commoners do? Genom of Gojosian said in a deep voice. In short, without I's orders, you are not allowed to kill Eastern Chu's commoners. Reporting to Prince, Yuan Pei led tens of thousands of Mahist army to break out of the encirclement and head towards Jiangxia. Hearing this, Genom of Gojosian frowned. What happened? The troops that the heir sent to stop Yuan Pei were ambushed and completely wiped out. Moreover, Yuan Pei seems to be very clear about our army's layout and terrain. He led his troops to split up and pass through our army's gaps. Although he lost some troops, the Mahist army's main force did not suffer too much damage. Reporting to Prince, we just received news from the Southern Army. 3 days ago, the heir was ambushed and the heir was seriously injured. Genom of Gojosian suddenly stood up. How is Tingfeng? The heir is no longer in danger, but his injuries are quite serious. I'm afraid he won't be able to lead troops in a short period of time. Genom of Gojosian lowered his head and pondered for a long time. He slowly suppressed the anger in his heart and waved his hand. I understand. You may leave first. The originally joyous atmosphere in the large tent became gloomy because of the successive news. After a long time, Genom of Gojosian laughed softly. Good, the Ding Palace is indeed filled with experts. In this battle, I did not win. Prince? Forget it. Send someone to tell Tingfeng that I will send someone else to take over the Southern Army. Tell him to come to Xinyang as soon as possible. Genom of Gojosian waved his hand and calmly said, no matter what, Xinyang is already ours. Let him take charge of the situation. I don't believe that those provisions and gold and silver can fly away. They must still be in the city. Yes. On the road after the heavy rain, Yili rode at the front of the army, but her beautiful brows were tightly knitted and she did not speak. Nan Ho and the others were by her side. Seeing her so curious, they asked, What's wrong, princess? Yili shook her head and said, Nothing, I'm just worried about the situation in Xinyang. Nan Ho raised his eyebrows in confusion. Xinyang's fall was already a foregone conclusion. What was there to worry about? Yili frowned and looked at the roadside. Because they were not on the official road, there was a steady stream of people fleeing from the northwest. Yili had mixed feelings as she looked at the sorry state of the commoners with their families. In truth, the reason why the war was so one-sided was mostly because of the infighting in the imperial court. If they had been prepared and sent reinforcements in time, this would not have happened. In any era, the ones who would suffer the most from the flames of war would always be the common people. Yili vaguely remembered a sentence that her teacher had taught her in her previous life. Prosperity, the common people suffer. Death, the people suffer. Wang Fei. Zhuo Jing urged his horse to catch up from behind. He rode half a horse's length behind Yili and spoke in a low voice. Yili pulled on the reins slightly and slowed down. She tilted her head to look at Zhuo Jing. Zhuo Jing said in a low voice, I just received news that Xinyang has fallen. Yili nodded, her expression as usual. The fall of Xinyang was within everyone's expectations. After a moment of silence, she asked, How is General Yuan? General Yuan has already brought his men back to Jiangxia. But... Zhuo Jing hesitated for a moment. I just received news. The Xiling army has slaughtered Xinyang city. What? Yili's expression darkened. Her originally gentle features were instantly dyed with a layer of murderous frost. Nan Ho, who was closest to them, clearly heard Zhuo Jing's words. The reins in his hand shook and he quickly steadied himself. He only stared fixedly at Zhuo Jing without speaking. Zhuo Jing said in a low voice, After the Xiling army entered the city, they clashed with the common people. Afterwards, the general who led the attack, Zheng Bian, gave the order to slaughter Xinyang. What did Xiling's Genom of Gojosian mean? Genom of Gojosian did not go to the front lines. By the time he gave the order to stop it, it was already too late. At least 2/3 of the common people in Xinjiang died an unnatural death. Zhuo Jing's voice was slightly hoarse. Since the founding of Dechu state, this was the first time that a city had been slaughtered. Many of the soldiers could not accept this. Yili laughed coldly. She pulled on the reins and galloped forward. Nanho paused and looked at Zhuo Jing with some confusion. Zhuo Jing hesitated for a moment before following. Yili did not go far. She stopped at the side of the road and silently watched the fleeing common people pass by. Zhuo Jing said in a low voice, "Wang Fei." Yili turned to look at him. She played with the horsewhip in one hand as she said, "Someone once told me that letting the common people personally experience war is a disgrace to the soldiers and the country." Zhuo Jing advised, "This is not Wang Fei's fault." Yili shook her head and laughed coldly, "Zheng Bian, is it? His head will be at the king's manor. I want his head as a sacrifice to the souls of the people of Xinjiang city. This subordinate understands. I guarantee that within 10 days, Zheng Bian's head will be hung on the walls of Xinjiang city." 7 days later, when Genom of Gojoseon's army had reached Jiangxia, Lei Tengfeng, who had stayed behind in Xinjiang, sent someone to deliver a secret letter. Zheng Bian, who had also stayed in Xinjiang city, had been killed in his own room. His head was hung on the walls of Xinjiang city. Next to the head was a flying dragon and phoenix character. It clearly stated that the murderer was from the king's manor. After receiving Lei Tengfeng's secret letter, Genom of Gojoseon's face was as calm as water. After thinking for a while, he replied to Lei Tengfeng and ordered the attack on Jiangxia to be stepped up. Jiangxia was a small city less than 200 li away from Xinjiang. The city was less than a third the size of Xinjiang city and was surrounded by mountains on 3 sides. However, Shiling's military strength was equivalent to the sum of all the cities they had conquered in the past. The Shiling army, which had been unstoppable and seemingly invincible, finally witnessed the true strength of the Dechu state's army in front of this small city. Genom of Gojoseon, who had not personally participated in the attack on a large city like Xinjiang, personally stood behind the army this time. He stood on the hill and watched with his own eyes as the soldiers of the 2 armies fought endlessly below the city. He watched as the black-clothed soldiers on the city walls continuously beat down the enemies who tried to climb up the city walls as if they never knew fatigue. "Prince, I didn't expect a small city of 50,000 people to be so difficult to deal with. Shouldn't we think of something?" The general standing behind him asked in a low voice. He looked at the black-clothed figures on the city walls with eyes full of frustration and shadow. This was a mark that the Mahist army had used countless blood and lives to deeply engrave in the hearts of their enemies over the past 100 years. Genom of Gojoseon sighed softly and said, "Fortunately, the emperor of the Dechu state does not trust the king's manor very much." The generals behind him did not ask why, because they were also rejoicing. If the ruler and his subjects of the Dechu state knew each other and trusted each other, why would they worry about the world being unjust? Day and night, step up the attack. We must take Jiangxia before the reinforcements from the Prince Ding mansion arrive. Genom of Gojoseon said sternly. This general obeys. On the city walls in the distance, the gray-haired old General Yuan Pei stared at the enemy troops below the city walls, who seemed to never retreat. His brows were deeply furrowed. His eyes, which had seen through the world, were bloodshot and tired, but his back was straight. His eyes, which stared at the city walls, were filled with the determination to live and die with Jiangxia. Chapter 316. General Yuan. Ling Qingyu hurried over. It had been less than a month since the expedition, but Ling Qingyu's arrogant and indifferent young face was full of vicissitudes and frustration. Yuan Pei looked at him and shook his head. He sighed softly. "General Leng, what's the matter?" Ling Qingyu glanced at the place where the banners were fluttering in the distance and frowned. "General Yuan, I'm afraid it'll be too much of a blow to the morale of the soldiers if we don't come out." Yuan Pei said, "General Leng, don't worry. The morale of the Mahist army will not be suppressed just because of these few days. Everyone knows that our army doesn't have the strength to fight against Xiling at all. The only thing we can do now is to defend and wait for reinforcements. Ling Qingyu glanced at the soldiers on the city wall, and his eyes darkened. Yuan Pei was right. What was really hit was not the morale of the Mahist army, but the morale of the less than 10,000 soldiers he had brought out of Xinyang city. After this great defeat, these remnants of the defeated army had long since collapsed. In the past few days, the West Hills soldiers had been attacking non-stop, making them even more frightened. If this continued, there would be trouble before Jiangxia was broken. This is a battlefield. My mission is to protect Jiangxia. General Leng, a momentary dispute won't bring any benefits to the current situation. The Xiling soldiers are not useless. Once tens of thousands of us enter an army of hundreds of thousands, it'll be no different from water entering the sea. We can only be swallowed by them, Yuan Pei said earnestly. Ling Qingyu was silent. It was not that he didn't understand what Yuan Pei said, but he really couldn't bear the current predicament. It was the first time in his life that he had led an army and ended up like this. In fact, the outcome of this war had little to do with him. It could be foreseen that even if what awaited him in the near future was not the emperor's punishment, it would be a lifetime of idleness. He would never have the chance to lead an army again. Besieging the city, defending the city. The soldiers on both sides fought tirelessly day and night. Corpses piled up under the city wall and blood flowed like a river. The corpses of their own people and the corpses of their enemies could no longer be distinguished. Everyone seemed to be fighting by instinct. However, Jiangxia's military strength was only 50,000, and this included the number of people who had died in the battle to support Xinyang. In reality, there were less than 40,000 people. Even if the remnants of the defeated soldiers who had retreated from Xinyang were included, there were less than 50,000 people. Their enemy, on the other hand, had over 200,000 elite soldiers. These soldiers were trained by Genom of Gojoseon over the past 10 years, and they were the best of the best. The number of soldiers guarding the city of Jiangxia was decreasing. Every time, it seemed like the city gate would be breached in the next moment. However, as time passed, the flags hanging on the city gate tower still belonged to the Dechu state and the Mahist army. Behind the Xiling army, Genom of Gojoseon stared solemnly at the tightly shut city gate in the distance. Prince, they can't hold on any longer. Genom of Gojoseon did not say anything, but his eyes were filled with respect for his enemy. It had been 5 days and 24 hours of continuous fierce attacks. There were only tens of thousands of people. Even he himself might not be able to guarantee that he could hold on until now. This was not something that could be done with wisdom and ability. The entire army must also have unparalleled faith and determination. After a long while, Genom of Gojoseon said in a deep voice, "Continue. Take down Jiangxia in 2 hours." More than 2 hours later, the city gate of Jiangxia finally fell heavily and slowly. On the city gate tower, Yuan Pei, who was covered in blood, casually threw away his battle robe and glanced at the soldiers on the city gate tower. He said sternly, "Kill." All the soldiers' eyes were red. It was a disgrace for the city guarded by the Mahist army to be trampled by the enemy. They must use the enemy's blood to wash away this shame. All the soldiers desperately pounced on the enemy closest to them. On the city gate tower, at the city gate, and on the streets, killing was everywhere. Ling Qingyu stood at the corner of the street, watching the killing in front of him. His eyes were so red that it seemed like blood would drip out. Behind him was a group of defeated soldiers. They could no longer fight after escaping from Xinyang, and no one asked them to pick up their weapons again. Ling Qingyu looked back at them and said in a deep voice, "Do you see? They are the same as you, soldiers of Dechu state." The city was also breached. What did they do? What did we do? It's my incompetence that I couldn't defend Xinyang. You're on your own. With that, he pulled out his sword and rushed out. The remaining soldiers looked at each other. After a long time, one of them rushed out with a knife in his hand. Then another, and another. A group of soldiers completely different from the Black Mahist army rushed out from the corner of the street and pounced on the enemy troops pouring in from the city gate. The Wiling soldiers were blocked from entering the city, which aroused the bestial nature in their hearts. They howled and pounced on every soldier of the Chu state. In an instant, blood spurted out and covered the streets. Rumble, an earth-shattering sound came from afar. Everyone couldn't help but be stunned. The surviving Mahist army soldiers were ecstatic and angry. Black Cloud Cavalry. The Black Cloud Cavalry is here. Reinforcements are here. On the wide street, a black mass of people rushed over with great momentum and ferocious killing intent. The leader, a man in red, galloped over on his horse. His clear voice was full of murderous intent. Block the city gate. Don't let any of the soldiers who entered the city out. Left and right wings, go up the city wall. Yes. The Black Army emerged from the end of the street like a tide and quickly pounced on the people fighting on the street and at the city gate. The city gate that had collapsed a quarter of an hour ago was quickly closed again. The Wiling soldiers who rushed into Jiangxia City in order to snatch military merits were horrified to find that they had become turtles in a jar, trapped beasts in a cage. The soldiers in black methodically rushed to where they needed to go. Countless people in black suddenly appeared on the city wall that had been filled with the gray figures of the Wiling soldiers. The killing resumed. In the distance, Genom of Gojoseon saw the sudden appearance of the soldiers in black on the city wall. His expression changed. Then he saw a flamboyant figure in red appear on the city wall. His body was like an invincible dragon. Prince, that is Feng Zhiao. The people of the Chu capital call him Third Young Master Feng. He is the son of a concubine of the richest man in the Chu capital. He was expelled from his family when he was young. He followed Mo Xiuyao on the battlefield in his teens. He is Mo Xiuyao's most trusted aide. His appearance here must mean that the Mahist army's reinforcements have arrived. Genom of Gojoseon's expression was gloomy. He said in a low voice, "Continue the attack." The war drums shook the sky. The gray figures and the black figures fought fiercely. But the gate of Jiangxia City was never pushed open again. When countless archers in black appeared on the city wall and arrows rained down on the people below the city wall, a snow-white slender figure calmly walked up the city wall. Standing beside her were South Marquis Muyang and Zhuo Jing. It was obviously a bloody storm, but the snow-white robe was unexpectedly not stained with any blood. The spotless white robe gave people a kind of inexplicable coldness and sternness. Yi Li stood on the city wall and looked at the commander flag of the Shiling army behind the enemy in the distance. Even if she could not see the other person's face, she could still feel the majestic momentum and exposed anger on the other side. Her lips slightly curved into a sneer. She ordered in a cold voice, "Don't leave any of the Wiling soldiers in Jiangxia City. Throw all the corpses out of the city." Chapter 317. Zhuo Jing nodded. This subordinate obeys. Yi Li looked back and revealed a provocative smile at a certain place in the distance. "Is that the Ding King's consort?" Genom of Gojoseon asked in a deep voice. The general beside him looked at the graceful woman in snow-white clothes on the city wall and hesitated before saying, "It seems that she is the Ding King's consort." In fact, not many people had seen the Ding King's consort. However, a woman who could appear with the Mahist army on the city wall of Jiangxia should be the Ding King's consort. Genom of Gojoseon looked for a long time before suddenly laughing out loud. "Good. Interesting, the Ding King's consort. It is said that the women of Eastern Chu are weak, but this Ding King's consort is even better than the noble ladies of West Hill. No wonder Princess Lingyun was scared out of her wits." The general beside him had a stiff smile on his face. He didn't know whether he should agree with Genom of Gojoseon's praise of the Ding King's consort. Now, the Ding King's consort had single-handedly ruined their plan to take Jiangxia. Moreover, the soldiers who had previously rushed into Jiangxia City were most likely already dead by now. As a result, the number of soldiers they had lost in this small city of Jiangxia had exceeded the total number of soldiers they had lost during this time. This was undoubtedly a heavy blow to the morale of the Shilin army. Prince, the soldiers who rushed into the city, Genom of Gojoseon waved his hand and shook his head. It's too late. Attack the city with all your strength. Capture the Ding King's consort alive and you will be rewarded with 1,000 marquises. Yes. When it was close to evening, the West Hill finally retreated. Without knowing how many reinforcements the Mahist army had, it was unwise to continue such a fierce attack. If the strength of the two armies was similar, then it was likely that both sides would suffer in the end. After all, this was Eastern Chu's territory. Eastern Chu could continuously replenish soldiers and provisions at any time. After their harvest in Xinjiang was clearly lower than expected, they had to be careful everywhere. Otherwise, if they weren't careful, they would be consigned to eternal damnation. Seeing the Shilin army quickly retreating after the horn sounded, the people on the city wall heaved a sigh of relief. The remaining soldiers of Jiangxia city couldn't help but cheer. Yuan Pei walked in front of Yi Li, wearing clothes that were half-dried and covered in wounds. This general, Yuan Pei, the defending general of Jiangxia, greets Wang Fei. Yi Li hurriedly reached out to stop him from kneeling down. She said in a deep voice, "Old general, you've worked hard. It's this consort's fault for being late and causing trouble to the general." Yuan Pei's expression changed. His bloodshot eyes could not help but flicker with a suspicious light. He raised his voice and said, "This general does not dare. This general is incompetent and nearly caused Jiangxia to fall into the hands of the West Hill. I dare not complain." Yi Li smiled faintly and said, "The situation forced you to do so. It is not your fault. There's no need for us to delve deeper into these matters. General, take your men and rest for a while. Leave Jiangxia to us for the time being." Yuan Pei nodded heavily. Feng Zhiyao stood behind Yi Li and said with a smile, "General Yuan, please rest assured. Feng San will never let the West Hill people take a step past Jiangxia." Yuan Pei was not polite. He cupped his hands and said, "Thank you for your hard work, General Feng." After rearranging the city defense, Yi Li led her men down the city tower. As soon as she walked down the city tower, she saw Ling Qingyu standing under the city wall with a blood-stained sword with a wooden expression. After thinking for a while, Yi Li stepped forward and asked, "General Leng, are you okay?" Ling Qingyu looked up at Yi Li and said with a wry smile, "What's wrong with a defeated general?" Yi Li raised her eyebrows slightly and said, "Victory and defeat are common in war. This is not all General Leng's fault. General, take care." Ling Qingyu was stunned for a while before saying, "Thank you, Princess." After watching Yi Li leave, Ling Qingyu looked at the long sword in his hand and put it back into the sheath. Princess Ding might be right. This failure was not his fault alone, but he was the only one who could bear the responsibility for it now. Fortunately, Jiangxia was still there, and the Mahist army had arrived. "General Leng." Ling Qingyu turned to leave when Marquis Nan's voice came from behind. Marquis Nan stood on the side of the street. He was obviously older and more tired than the last time they met. This war had just begun, but many of them seemed to have aged 10 years. Marquis Nan looked at Ling Qingyu for a long time before asking in a deep voice, "General Leng, do you have any news about Quan Er?" Ling Qingyu said sadly, "That day, the enemy attacked. The heir led a group of people to divert the enemy's attention, and they were all wiped out. Marquis, I'm sorry. I understand." The faint light in Marquis Nan's eyes gradually faded as he sighed softly and said in a low voice. He didn't even say goodbye to Ling Qingyu and turned to leave. Ling Qingyu looked at Marquis Nan's lonely and bleak figure and felt a chill in his bones. In the past, he had yearned for the battlefield. He thought that the battlefield was hot-blooded and that countless people would flock to it. But now, after a defeat, he finally understood the coldness and pain under such hot-bloodedness. Jiangxia was a small city. Yi Li and the others temporarily lived in General Yuan Pei's mansion. The so-called general's mansion was actually just a medium-sized courtyard in Jiangxia City. Veteran generals like Yuan Pei and Zhang Qilan were definitely not inferior to the Defender General of the state, Murong Shen, and the others. However, because they were generals of the Mo army, they were oppressed indefinitely, and could never truly obtain the glory and honor that should have belonged to them. Because of Yi Li's arrival, Yuan Pei moved his wife and children from the main courtyard to the side courtyard in the backyard. Understanding Yuan Pei's intentions and loyalty to the Prince Ding mansion, Yi Li didn't refuse and casually chose a room to live in. She didn't have time to tidy up. After casually freshening up, she went to the front hall to discuss the war with everyone. When Yi Li stepped into the study, it was already full of people. They were discussing something intensely and didn't quiet down until Yi Li came in. Yuan Pei personally went forward to invite Yi Li to sit in the main seat. After Yi Li sat down, he tidied up his clothes and bowed solemnly. "Thank you, Princess Consort, for saving my life." Yi Li sighed helplessly and motioned for Zhuo Jing, who was standing beside her, to come forward and help Yuan Pei up. "General Yuan, there's no need for these formalities. Stand up and speak," Yi Li said seriously. Yuan Pei stood up and returned to his seat. Reporting to Princess Consort, Shi Ling has stationed 300,000 soldiers outside Jiangxia. They are clearly determined to take Jiangxia. I've received news that the armies in the north and south are faintly drawing closer to Jiangxia. Once the three armies converge, there will be close to 500,000 soldiers surrounding Jiangxia. Even though our army is brave, Jiangxia is small and the people are weak. We lack military supplies. At that time, I'm afraid we won't be able to resist the siege of 500,000 soldiers. Princess Consort, please make early plans." Yi Li nodded and said, "Thank you, General Yuan, for your reminder. I know what to do. As for the issue of rations, there's no need to worry. The imperial court will naturally send enough rations." "Marquis Nan, Shizimu, don't you think so?" Marquis Nan was a little absent-minded. When he heard Yi Li's words, he raised his head and smiled faintly. "Princess Consort is right. We are going through fire and water on the battlefield. The imperial court and the emperor will naturally not mistreat the soldiers on the front lines." Chapter 318. Yi Li looked at Marquis Nan and clearly saw the exhaustion and sadness in his eyes. She didn't know what Ling Qingyu said to him, but she could roughly guess because there was still no news of Marquis Nan's heir. It was hard not to have some bad thoughts about it. She glanced at Marquis Nan worriedly, and Marquis Nan nodded at her to indicate that he was fine. Despite Marquis Nan's statement, everyone's expressions still didn't improve. After so many years, the Mahist army no longer had much hope for that person in the palace. Yi Li saw everyone's expression, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she turned around and discussed the war with the generals. After the discussion, everyone took their leave. Marquis Nan still sat in his seat without moving. Yi Li originally thought that Marquis Nan had something to say, but when everyone left, she realized that Marquis Nan was just in a daze. She frowned slightly and called out worriedly, "Marquis?" Marquis Nan's eyes were blank, and it took him a while to recover. He still looked at Yi Li in a daze and said slowly, "Princess Consort, sorry to disturb you. This Marquis will also take his leave." Yi Li shook her head and said, "Marquis Nan, the heir's identity is different. No news is good news now. There are many important matters in the army that require Marquis Nan's decision." Marquis Nan forced a smile and looked up at Yi Li. "The old duke once said that Princess Consort is an extraordinary person. This Marquis has seen it all along the way. I still have to trouble Princess Consort with all the matters in the army. This Marquis is afraid that I can't do it." Marquis Nan, Yi Li still wanted to say something, but Marquis Nan waved his hand and said, "This Marquis will take his leave first." Princess consort should also rest early. Watching Marquis Nan walk out of the door, Yili finally swallowed her words. Marquis Nan, take care. Late at night, Yili strolled along the winding corridor in the study. She looked up at the silver moon in the sky and frowned slightly. Soon, it would be the night of the next full moon. However, there was still no news of Mo Xiaoyao, who had gone to the northern tribes. She could not help but worry. Furthermore, Marquis Nan had already made it clear that he did not wish to take charge. This was the first time in her life that she was leading an army of hundreds of thousands. She was not as calm and confident as she appeared. Xiaoyao, where are you now? Who? Come out. Under the moonlight, Yili suddenly came back to her senses and pointed at the end of the corridor behind her. After a while, a tall figure walked out from the corner. Yili was slightly taken aback. She raised her brows and narrowed her cold eyes. Mu, what are you doing here so late at night? Mu Yang's expression was somewhat complicated as he looked at Yili's hand that was facing him. That pair of slender jade-like hands concealed a murderous intent. Mu Yang coughed lightly. This one did not mean to offend. Please forgive me for disturbing Princess. Yili smiled faintly and calmly withdrew her hand into her sleeve. She raised her hand and stroked the hair by her ear. It's so late. Mu, do you have something to say? A surprised expression flashed across Mu Yang's face. Very quickly, Mu Yang smiled faintly. Princess is indeed quick-witted. This one is just, has Marquis Nan agreed to hand over the decision-making power of the army to Princess? Yili raised her brows and smiled faintly. Mu may be the heir of Marquis Muyang, but you are not Marquis Muyang himself. Furthermore, even Marquis Muyang does not have the right to intervene in the military matters. Mu, you are only Marquis Nan, a lieutenant under the deputy commander of the army. Towards Yili's obvious contempt, Muyang did not get angry. He leaned against the railing of the corridor with his hands behind his back. This one thinks that Princess knows the true meaning and function of this one's lieutenant status? Yili raised her brows and smiled. So what? Marquis Nan's heart is broken. Marquis Nan's heir's life and death is unknown. He is unable to command the army. Now that the Xiling army is at the city gates, what does Lieutenant Mu think we should do? Facing the calmness of the woman in front of him, Mu Yang could not help but feel helpless and tired from the bottom of his heart. Of course, he understood Princess Ding's meaning. It was already difficult for Marquis Nan to control the Mahist army with his identity. Not to mention that he did not even have the time to change the commander. Although he had the identity of heir, he only had the military position of a lieutenant. Not to mention commanding the Mahist army, even if he wanted to lead a part of the Mahist army, without Princess Ding's approval, no one would accept it. Mu Yang was never a person who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. Therefore, he did not have any plans to seize control of the Mahist army. However, the woman standing in front of him was clearly a woman who was not even 20 years old. But the aura and sharpness in her movements made him, a man of 7 feet, unable to help but admire her. This kind of woman had completely surpassed the meaning and scope of a woman in Mu Yang's understanding. It was as if she did not need to rely on anyone, and no one could stop her. No one could stand in front of her. Mu Yang suddenly thought of the handsome man who was still elegant and calm even when sitting in a wheelchair. In this world, only that kind of man could match this kind of woman. Mu. Yili looked at the person who was looking at her and frowned. Mu Yang came back to his senses and smiled apologetically. Princess has misunderstood this one's meaning. This one did not intend to make things difficult for Princess. Yili raised her brows, but smiled without saying anything. Mu Yang said, right now, Prince Li's rebellion in the south has not been quelled, and Xiling is invading. In the north, the northern tribes are eyeing covetously. The only ones who can wipe out the enemy are the king's household and the Mahist army. Although Mu Yang is not talented, but I know that the world is most important. Why should I make things difficult for Princess? Yili looked at him and smiled faintly. Mu is not making things difficult for this consort. Aren't you afraid that the person in the palace will make things difficult for you? Mu Yang laughed heartily. Many thanks for Princess's concern. This one naturally knows. But there is a small matter that I hope Princess will agree to. Mu, speak frankly. Mu Yang pondered for a moment and said, this one does not know if my father and the Ding King's household have any unpleasant past. I only hope that Princess will give this one face and be magnanimous. Yili was surprised and sighed after a long time. Marquis Muyang has a good son. With a son like this, Marquis Muyang should be satisfied for life. All right, this consort promises you. Muyang cupped his hands and said, many thanks, Princess. Yili shook her head. Mu does not need to thank me. This consort is not at a disadvantage in making this deal with Mu. After all, compared to the matters on the battlefield, the other small grudges are nothing. Mu Yang chuckled in a low voice, hearing Wang Fei's words, this one feels ashamed and unable to show his face. Yili smiled. It's my slip of the tongue. Mu, please do not blame me. It's getting late. Mu should rest early. Princess, please wait. Mu Yang impatiently said, Princess, may I ask? Do you have any news about Yaoji? Yili turned around in surprise. Under the moonlight, she could clearly see the undisguised worry and longing on the man's face. Yili shook her head and looked at the disappointment that flashed across Mu Yang's face. She softly said, Mu, some people and some things are missed. Chapter 319. Mu Yang stared at her unwillingly. How do you know that it can't be reunited? Yili said, I don't know if there is such a thing as a broken mirror being reunited, but, the bronze mirror, even if it is reunited, it can't cover up the previous crack. Also, does Shitzi really have a way to get the best of both worlds? Mu Yang's face showed a trace of frustration and annoyance. Yili didn't say anything else and turned to leave. She lightly recited, I once worried too much about love-harming Fan Xing, but when I entered the mountain, I feared that I would lose a city. Is there a way to get the best of both worlds, to live up to Tathagata and Qing? Is there a way to get the best of both worlds? Mu Yang softly recited with a faint bitter smile on his lips. He would never be able to convince Yaoji to become a concubine of Marquis Muyang's household, just like he would never be able to convince his proud parents to accept Yaoji as their daughter-in-law. Live up to Tathagata and Qing. Did the person who wrote this poem also experience the same struggle and pain as him? The next morning, the Shilling army didn't attack again, which was rare. Yili sat in the study and sorted out the news and analysis of the battle. Marquis Nan didn't say that he couldn't do anything to decline. Early in the morning, when Yili just got up, someone came to report that Marquis Nan was seriously ill. Although there weren't any famous doctors in Jiangxia City, fortunately, the medical skills of the Mo family army's military doctors were extremely good. They quickly went over to diagnose and treat the Marquis and reported back to Yili. Although the southern Marquis wasn't very old, he had been living like a prince all year round. Therefore, he was too tired and anxious during the march, which caused him to suddenly fall ill. Helpless, Yili could only send people to take care of him and speed up the search for Marquis Nan's heir. Qin Feng just finished his mission and secretly returned to Jiangxia last night. Yili called him to the study early in the morning and told him to look for Marquis Nan's heir. Princess, Officer Yun is fighting with someone at the military field. Just as she was talking to Qin Feng, someone rushed in from outside the door to report. Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled. She turned to Qin Feng and Zhuo Jing and said, We have been on the road for several days. Yesterday we had a big fight, but this morning we were able to get up and fight. It seems that we have underestimated the abilities of our Mahist army. Zhuo Jing rubbed his nose and laughed in a low voice. He said, Wang Fei is right. Yili rose and rubbed her shoulders. She said, since that's the case, let's go take a look. Because it was the time when the two armies were facing each other, the Mahist army's barracks were stationed in an open space not far from Jiangxia city. All around, there were soldiers guarding the roads. An empty space in the middle of the barracks was used as a temporary drill ground. By the time Yili and the others arrived, Yun Ting was already wrestling with a young general of similar age. There were also a few high-ranking Mahist army generals and many soldiers standing at the side. Mu Yang, who had been watching from the side, was the first to see Yili come in. He turned his head and smiled at her. Yili nodded slightly. Qin Feng and Zhuo Jing parted the crowd to make a path. Everyone looked at the two young but outstanding generals fighting fiercely. Many people didn't even notice that Yili had walked to the front. Wang Fei. It was Mu Yang who spoke. The people who had been watching from the side finally recovered. Their expressions changed slightly as they hurriedly bowed to Yili. Some people wanted to go forward and pull the two people apart. Yili waved her hand and said with a smile, no matter. Let's wait until they have decided the victor. Although Yili said so, with the presence of the princess consort, the bustling and lively atmosphere in the school ground suddenly dissipated. Many people had awkward and reserved expressions on their faces. Yili didn't care. She smiled and turned to ask Mu Yang, who was standing next to her, Mu Shizhi, who do you think has a better chance of winning? Mu Yang smiled and raised an eyebrow as he said, this one thinks that Field Officer Yun Ting has a better chance. Instantly, the generals beside him all revealed unconvinced expressions. One of them had already blurted out, from what I see, Field Commandant Chen is still more powerful. When he said this, everyone saw that there wasn't any displeasure on Yili's face. They couldn't help but feel relieved. They all spoke out in support of the young field officer surnamed Chen. Mu Yang said in a low voice to Yili with a smile, Wang Fei, it seems that the Mahist army is also very xenophobic. Yun Ting was also a member of the Mahist army, and he was one that Princess Ding had personally cultivated. But after all, he was a newbie who came out of nowhere. Soldiers were all proud and arrogant. Naturally, there were many people who didn't like him. Yili didn't care. She smiled faintly and said, in the military camp, the strong are the kings. It's not a bad thing to occasionally learn from each other. As long as it doesn't affect the important matters, it's fine. When she was in the special forces in her previous life, any random soldier was the elite of the military. How could there be no competition when such a group of elites were squeezed together? And it was because of this competition that they worked harder to move forward. Because the weak would be eliminated in the end. For the same reason, many of the generals in the Mahist army were promoted from ordinary soldiers. There were also some who had served the Ding king's household for generations. Although Yun Ting had made contributions in the Battle of Yonglin, it wasn't worth mentioning to the soldiers of the Mahist army. Not to mention that he was promoted by her, the Wang Fei, who didn't know the depth of his abilities. Mu Yang deeply looked at Yili and chuckled softly, Wang Fei is right. The two people who were fighting in the middle of the field finally noticed that something was wrong with the onlookers outside. As soon as they looked back, they saw Yili standing on the side and looking at them with interest. Yun Ting's face was embarrassed. For a moment, he was careless and was punched by the other side. However, the other side still had a sense of awe for the princess consort of Ding. After they succeeded, they no longer entangled. The two people quickly separated. They just stared at each other to let people know that they were still very dissatisfied with each other. Yili raised her hand and high-fived. She looked at the two with a smile and said, why did you stop? Wang Fei. Yun Ting lowered his head in shame. In the past few months, he had been convinced by Princess Ding. He was also proud of being able to be promoted and cultivated by the Wang Fei. Therefore, when faced with the contemptuous attitude of several young generals in the Mahist army, he was so easily angered that he actually fought with them in a fit of anger. Yili smiled and said, it's okay. It's common for everyone to learn from each other in the military camp. Don't be embarrassed. Or, is Ben Fei hindering you from playing? As soon as these words came out, the several generals standing on the side couldn't help blushing. If they didn't have doubts about Yun Ting and even about Wang Fei's ability, they wouldn't have let the two people fight like this. Now, looking at Wang Fei's attitude, it seemed that these 7-foot men were narrow-minded. Yi Li saw that they didn't intend to fight, so she smiled and waved her hand to let the soldiers around her disperse. She took several generals to the big tent in the military camp. Right now, Lu Jingxian was in charge of the military camp outside the city. However, he had gone into the city early in the morning to discuss the defense with the guards in the city. He wasn't in the camp, so no one cared when the two field officers fought. Lu Jingxian had hurried back as soon as he received the news in the city, but he was still a step slower than Yi Li. He could only glare at Field Officer Chen with a dark face and go forward to ask for forgiveness. Chapter 320. Yi Li's laughter was clear and melodious. She raised a hand to indicate for Zhuo Jing to help Lu Jingxian up. She smiled and said, "General Lu, you don't have to be like this. Young people only need to know their limits. Just treat fighting as bonding." The group of people returned to the large tent and sat down. Lu Jingxian called Field Officer Chen in front of him to ask about the reason for the fight. It was not a rare thing to fight in the military, but if they wanted to fight, they could do it on the practice field or the arena. It was not proper to fight in front of normal soldiers regardless of the situation. It was easy for the soldiers to think that the relationship between the generals was not good. Field Officer Chen glanced sideways at Yun Ting and snorted lightly. He did not respond to Lu Jingxian's words. Yun Ting was once again provoked by his snort of disdain. He raised his chin and said, "You don't agree? If you don't agree, we can fight again." Field Officer Chen smiled coldly and said with a raised eyebrow, "You think he is afraid of you? If it wasn't for, you would beat you until you were looking for your teeth on the ground. Boasting shamelessly, aren't you afraid of the wind biting your tongue?" Yun Ting mocked. "Shut up." Lu Jingxian was furious. It was one thing for two field officers to fight in front of so many generals and Princess Ding, but they were cursing in public. They had no regard for the law. Yi Li put down the teacup in her hand and said with a faint smile to Lu Jingxian, "General Lu, calm down. It is inevitable that young people are young and impetuous. General does not need to be angry. Yun Ting, after staying in Jing for a few months, to say nothing else, your mouth has become much sharper." Yun Ting's face twisted. He was considered young in the military, but he was still a few years older than Dingguo Wang Fei. Being called young and impetuous by Princess Ding, who was younger than him, he couldn't help but feel his face heat up. He lowered his head and said, "This subordinate has been rash. Wang Fei, please punish me." Ben Fei said, "I don't blame you, so I don't blame you." Yi Li said, "Why don't you tell me why the two of you are, sparring so early in the morning?" Commandant Chen and Yun Ting had a rare moment of hesitation. They looked at Yi Li without saying anything. Yi Li frowned. "What? Can't he say it? Or should I ask the generals who were present?" Field Officer Chen took a step forward and gritted his teeth. "This subordinate should not have spoken disrespectfully to Wang Fei, so I had a conflict with Field Officer Yun. Wang Fei, please punish me. This subordinate is willing to accept any punishment." Yi Li stared at him for a moment and then nodded, saying, "You dare to take responsibility for your actions." Commandant Chen remained silent. Yun Ting looked at everyone and also took a step forward. "This subordinate is also in the wrong. I'm willing to be punished together with Commandant Chen." Looking at Yun Ting's young face, Yi Li nodded inwardly. There were benefits to learning and teaching for a few months. If it was a few months ago, with Yun Ting's personality, he definitely would not ask for punishment at this time. There was no other reason other than that he understood how to conduct himself better. The Mahist army were not unreasonable people. Seeing Yunting say this, their expressions became much better. After a moment of silence, Yili said in a light voice, Ben Fei has just taken control of the Mahist army and has not met any of the generals before. It is understandable that everyone is dissatisfied. Therefore, this matter will be let go. Right now, if anyone here still has any dissatisfaction, you can speak it out. Everyone here is a true hero who has fought on the battlefield for many years. Let's not learn from those roundabout things in the imperial court. Seeing that everyone was hesitating, Yili smiled and said, in this tent, the one who speaks is not guilty. If you have any thoughts, speak. Or are you all afraid that Ben Fei will retaliate after this? Everyone was silent for a while. A middle-aged deputy general stood up and raised his hands towards Yili, saying, Wang Fei, please forgive us. The original Master I is not here, so it is natural that Wang Fei is in command of the Mahist army. But war is not like anything else. It is the lives of tens of thousands of brothers. Therefore, this subordinate has thought more. Wang Fei is still young and was born into a scholarly family. This. Yili listened to her subordinate's words and nodded with a smile to show that she understood. The other people saw that she did not show any signs of anger and gathered their courage to stand and voice their doubts. It was just that Yili was still young and they had doubts about Yili's ability to lead troops and skills. Yili sat in the chair and silently waited for everyone to finish speaking. Then she smiled brightly and said, Ben Fei only now knows that the generals have so many worries. It really is Ben Fei's fault. Field Officer Chen, is it because of this that you are dissatisfied with Ben Fei? Field Officer Chen stiffened his neck and said, war is not child's play. If Wang Fei doesn't have true ability, this little general will naturally be dissatisfied. Chen Yun, impudent. Lu Jingxian shouted. Yili waved her hand and said with a smile, no matter. Ben Fei specializes in dealing with dissatisfaction. How about we go to the school field first to see who is better? This subordinate does not dare. Field Officer Chen Yun was clearly frightened by Yili's words and knelt on the ground with a thump. The generals of the Mahist army might have doubts about Wang Fei's ability to lead the Mahist army, but they were still very respectful of her status as the Ding Wang Fei. But the lives of the soldiers on the battlefield were more important to the outcome of the war. So they would not blindly trust her ability because of her status as the Ding Wang Fei. Now that Wang Fei said she wanted to compete with him, how could Chen Yun dare to act against his superior? Yili stood up and said faintly, get up. You're a man. Don't kneel just because you want to. What? Is it that a man like you is afraid of Ben Fei, a woman? Chen Yun's face turned red. For a moment, he didn't know if he should say he was afraid or not. Yili smiled slightly and walked out of the tent without caring about him. When Yili left, the others could only follow. Chen Yun looked helplessly at Lu Jingxian who was walking at the back. General. Lu Jingxian shook his head and sighed, let's go. Don't let Wang Fei wait for you. Yun Ting, who had already reached the door, turned his head and smiled at Chen Yun with some schadenfreude. Other people did not know of Wang Fei's skills, but he had seen it with his own eyes. If Chen Yun still wanted to go easy, he would definitely die a horrible death. On the school field, Yili stood with her hands behind her back. She smiled as she looked at Chen Yun who was hesitating. Unknowingly, many soldiers who had finished their training had gathered in the surroundings. Seeing Chen Yun was still hesitating, Yili smiled and said, Field Officer Chen, please come up. Chen Yun finally walked onto the school field. He did not look as spirited and vicious as when he had fought with Yun Ting. Instead, he appeared very restrained. He looked at Yili and said, Wang Fei, after you. Yili raised an eyebrow slightly. She knew that if she did not act, Chen Yun would not dare to act against her. She smiled and said, if that's the case, Field Officer Chen, be careful. Yili did not use the dagger she was used to. She turned and took a long sword from Zhuo Jing, who was standing at the side. The tip of the sword trembled and turned into a cold light as it shot towards Chen Yun. Chen Yun moved his body to the side to dodge the flying sword. Yi Li smiled and swept her long sword horizontally. In a blink, Yi Li had swung her sword a few times. Chen Yun was forced back a few steps at the same time. When the soldiers below the stage saw Chen Yun like this, they naturally booed. Chen Yun had originally planned to let Yi Li exchange a few blows and then find a chance to admit defeat. This way, he would not embarrass himself or Yi Li. But when Yi Li swung her first blow, he knew he was wrong. No matter if it was the posture of Wang Fei holding the sword or the angle of the blow, it was not just for show. In fact, each blow was very dangerous. But if he had not been nimble enough to dodge quickly, and if Wang Fei had not held back her strength, he would have had a few holes in his body. Chapter 321. Chen Yun flipped and quickly retreated to a safe distance. Yi Li did not chase after him. She put away her sword and stood in the middle of the field to look at him. Chen Yun raised his hands and said, "This subordinate has eyes but cannot see. Wang Fei, please forgive this subordinate." This subordinate dares to ask Wang Fei to redo the match. Finishing, he walked to the weapon rack at the side and took down a long spear. Shaking it in his hand, he stared at Yi Li with a serious expression. Yi Li nodded in satisfaction and said, "Very good, this is right. Field Officer Chen, please." "Excuse me," Chen Yun said loudly. The long spear in his hand stabbed straight at Yi Li. Yi Li nimbly stepped out of the way and the long sword in her hand danced beautifully. It was said that an inch longer was an inch stronger. The 3-chi long sword in Yi Li's hand did not have any advantage against the long spear in Chen Yun's hand. But the people below the stage quickly found that Wang Fei had kept the distance between the two within a certain range. And this distance greatly limited the advantage of the long spear in Chen Yun's movements. For a time, they were evenly matched. Below the stage, Feng Zhiao, who had arrived at an unknown time, lazily stood beside Mu Yang with his arms crossed. He asked with a grin, "Young Master Mu, who do you think will win between Princess Consort and Field Officer Chen?" Mu Yang smiled faintly and said, "This subordinate has had the fortune to see Princess Ding's skills. She is definitely a 1 in 10,000 expert. Field Officer Chen. I'm afraid he is still lacking a bit." Hearing Mu Yang's words, Lu Jingxian, who was at the side, turned his head to look at the two of them in surprise. Finally, his gaze fell on Feng Zhiao. Feng Zhiao and Lu Jingxian were old acquaintances. He did not hide it and said with a chuckle, "General Lu may not know, but Wang Fei's swordsmanship was personally taught by the prince. Also, Wang Fei is most likely the worst at swordsmanship." Hearing this, the expressions of the generals changed slightly. They had all seen Wang Fei's swordsmanship. It was not the best, but they could faintly see the murderous intent under the edge of the sword. That was a sword technique that could truly kill people, and this was said to be the one that Princess Consort was the least skilled in. In other words, Wang Fei and Chen Yun did not use their true skills. Mu Yang raised his head and looked at the graceful figure on the stage. He couldn't help but chuckle. He suddenly remembered what Yi Li had just said. Ai's imperial concubine specialized in dealing with all kinds of disobedience. In front of such a woman, how many people could truly be disobedient? On the stage, the two of them fought with great agility, and it was hard to tell who had the upper hand. Yi Li's 3 feet long sword was like a poisonous snake, attacking Chen Yun's vital points. Chen Yun was not willing to be outdone. His long spear danced in a watertight manner, and the two of them were in a deadlock for a while. Yi Li looked at the young general who had a serious expression on his face and smiled faintly. The long sword in his hand turned into a cold rainbow that shot straight towards Chen Yun's face. Chen Yun hurriedly waved his spear to block, but he saw the long sword that had been heading towards him turn midway and move along the body of the spear. Chen Yun only paused for a moment before he felt a chill on his neck. The tip of Yi Li's sword was already at his throat, but her other hand was tightly gripping the body of his spear. Yi Li raised an eyebrow and said with a slight smile, "Field Officer Chen." Chen Yun put down his spear and said in a low voice, "Wang Fei's swordsmanship is profound. This subordinate admits defeat." Yi Li did not make things difficult for him. She took back her long sword and threw it to Zhuo Jing, who was standing on the side of the stage. She turned and smiled at the generals below the stage. "Which other general is dissatisfied? Why don't you come up and try?" The generals looked at each other. A burly middle-aged man holding a pair of maces jumped onto the stage. He raised his hands in a bow and said, "This subordinate is Deputy General Lu Feng of the Mahist Army's Qizhou. Please teach me Wang Fei's skills." Yi Li nodded slightly and took 2 steps back. This General Lu was not like Chen Yun, who was slender and agile. With a glance, it was clear that he was a power-type opponent. Looking at his pair of maces, it was at least a few dozen caddies. It would not be comfortable to be hit by such a weapon. Yi Li was not a person who liked to flaunt her superiority, so she took out the dagger she was most comfortable with. Lu Feng looked with surprise at the dagger in Yi Li's hand that flashed with cold light. He said, "This is Wang Fei's weapon." Yi Li nodded and said, "General Lu, please. Then this subordinate will offend you. Wang Fei, be careful." After Lu Feng finished speaking, one of his maces swept towards Yi Li. Yi Li quickly moved out of the way. The dagger in her hand flashed with an icy light in the morning light. The people below the stage clearly found that when Yi Li had a dagger in her hand, she was clearly more dangerous than when she was holding a long sword. There were many times when Yi Li's dagger had narrowly missed Lu Feng's vital points. If it wasn't for Lu Feng's great strength, each of his moves containing an unstoppable force that forced her to dodge, Lu Feng would have been injured by that small dagger. Yi Li clearly understood Lu Feng's strengths and weaknesses. So she did not fight Lu Feng head-on. She used the advantage of her body to continuously exhaust Lu Feng's strength. At the same time, she waited for a chance to attack. Even though she did not succeed in injuring Lu Feng, she did succeed in giving him a great scare. Once again, Lu Feng raised his pair of maces and swung them towards Yi Li. Yi Li dodged to the side. She kicked in the air and her left hand slapped the ground. The dagger in her right hand went straight for Lu Feng's left shoulder. Seeing this, Lu Feng hurriedly raised his right mace. Yi Li had already flipped behind him. "General Lu." Lu Feng's body froze. The cold dagger was pressed against his back. Lu Feng had fought for many years and naturally had seen all kinds of injuries. At the same time, he knew that if Yi Li's stab was solid, he would be paralyzed for the rest of his life. Putting down the pair of maces, Lu Feng turned and bowed to Yi Li, saying, "Many thanks for Wang Fei's mercy. This general is convinced." Yi Li smiled slightly and said, "General Lu's strength is unmatched and his skills are not ordinary. Ben Fei is also very impressed." There was a moment of silence below the stage. Suddenly, there was a burst of cheers. The soldiers present all cheered. After winning 2 rounds in a row, the generals were completely convinced of Yi Li's skills. Naturally, they did not challenge her again. Yi Li had already won 2 rounds in a row. If she went up again, even if she won, it would be an unfair victory. It would be a waste of the reputation of a group of men taking turns to fight against a woman. Seeing Yi Li walk down the stage, everyone quickly went up. Lu Jingxian cupped his hands and said with a smile, "Wang Fei's display of skills today has truly made this subordinate prostrate in admiration. Us rough people don't know the rules and have offended Wang Fei. I hope Wang Fei will not blame us." Yi Li smiled and said, "General Lu is too serious. There's no need to take these small matters to heart. Ben Fei still has some matters to take care of in the city. I'll have to trouble General Lu to take care of the barracks." Lu Jingxian quickly replied, "Wang Fei can be at ease. Yi Li nodded and looked at Yun Ting with a smile as she said, "Commandant Yun." Yun Ting rubbed his head and said with a bitter face, "Wang Fei, this subordinate knows his wrongs." Yi Li nodded in satisfaction and said with a smile, "Knowing one's wrongs and being able to change is the greatest virtue. Have you been reading recently?" Thinking of the days when Wang Fei had just sent him to the Mahist army and the mountain of books in his room that was even taller than a person, the smile on Yun Ting's face became even more bitter. "I've read. I just read, Military Strategy." Yi Li's smile became even more amiable. "Your progress is not bad. Ben Fei just happened to need a few military strategy books to teach the soldiers. I'll have to trouble Commandant Yun to make 10 copies and give them to me in 3 days. "Yes, Wang Fei." Yun Ting's eyes were blank and his body was stiff. His expression was dazed as he watched Yi Li turn and leave. Chapter 322. "Brother, what's wrong?" Chen Yun looked at his mournful appearance and patted his shoulder as he asked. Yun Ting silently looked at him, then turned around and left. "If I continue to fight with you, I will be a pig." Chen Yun looked doubtfully at his back as he walked away in a daze. Then, he looked at his own hands in confusion. It was just a fight, there was no need to be so petty, right? Feng Zhiao walked forward, tapped his shoulder with the fan in his hand and said with a smile, "You don't need to mind, that kid is really annoyed at copying books. If Lieutenant Chen has nothing to do, you can help him write a few pages. I guarantee that he will treat you as his life's brother." Copying books? Chen Yun's face twisted a little, thinking of when he was young, he was chased by his father and teacher to copy books. He quickly shook his head, "Forget it. I will go and see if there is anything to eat. When Lieutenant Yun is tired of copying, I will send it to him to make up for it." As for copying books, there was no need, his handwriting could not be seen by others. When they left the city, they were in a hurry, but when they went back, they were not in a hurry. Yi Li's group strolled, taking the opportunity to look at the various checkpoints and the situation of the people. Although the war was imminent, the people of Jiangxia seemed to be very at ease. They were methodically living their own lives, as if there was no difference. Even if they had just experienced a bloody battle yesterday, and almost lost the city. Early in the morning, the people were still going out, opening their shops, there was no fear and uneasiness in their eyes. Feng Zhiao walked beside Yi Li, fanning himself while explaining to Yi Li, "These people completely trust the Mahist army, they believe that as long as the Mahist army is there, the city will not be lost, their homes will not be invaded by the enemy." Yi Li sighed softly. She did not know whether to be impressed or worried. To be able to let the people have such confidence in them, the Mahist army should be proud. But, when everyone had entrusted their trust and responsibility to the Mahist army, relying on them, this was a heavy pressure. It was no wonder that the successive masters of the Ding King's Fu were unable to let go of everything and retire. It was because the Ding King's Fu and the Mahist army had long become the spiritual and practical pillars of the Dechu state. If one day the Mahist army was no longer the Mahist army, would the Dechu state still be the Dechu state? "Your Highness, the emissary from West Hill wishes to see you." As soon as she walked to the entrance of the mansion, General Yuan Pei was already waiting for her. When he saw Yi Li and the others return, he hurriedly came forward to report. Yi Li frowned slightly and said, "A messenger from West Hill?" Yuan Pei nodded solemnly and said, "Just now, the West Hill emissary requested to see you outside the city. This subordinate acted on my own initiative and let them in. Right now, they are waiting in the outer courtyard for your Highness to summon them." Yi Li nodded and said, "General Yuan did well. Let's go see this West Hill emissary." To have the courage to enter Jiangxia at this time, they must not be ordinary people. Invite them to the study. Yes. Yi Li changed her clothes and returned to the study. After a while, General Yuan Pei led the West Hill emissary in. The leader was a middle-aged man with an ordinary face. Behind him was a general and 3 attendants. The group of 5 were all dressed in cloth and did not have swords. They seemed to be very confident and were not afraid to step into the city controlled by the Mahist army. The middle-aged man looked at Yi Li and stepped forward to cup his hands. I am a guest of West Hill's Genom of Gojoseon. Mo Fei greets Princess Ding of Eastern Chu. Mr. Mo, please rise. Yi Li gently raised her hand and said with a smile, what brings Mr. Mo here? Mo Fei looked at the people sitting in the study and said with a smile, indeed, Genom of Gojoseon has some small matters to consult your highness. But I wonder if I can speak with your highness alone. Yi Li smiled and said, it's not that I can't, but it's not necessary. As the temporary commander of the Mahist army, it is inappropriate for me to speak with the enemy emissary in private. Besides, there is nothing that cannot be said. If Mr. Mo has something to say, please say it face to face. On the side, Zhuo Jing sneered and said, speak in private? Who knows if you are waiting for an opportunity to assassinate our princess? Feng Zhiyao smiled lazily and said, I'm afraid we don't have the ability to assassinate your highness. But we must guard against others. Mo Fei's expression was ugly and he wanted to flare up, but he quickly suppressed it. He looked up at Yi Li and said, since your highness has said so, I will not force you. Presumably, the people here are your highness and the Ding Palace's trusted aides. Yi Li nodded indifferently. Mo Fei said, our prince has a letter for your highness. Please take a look. After that, he took out a letter from his sleeve and presented it. Zhuo Jing took the letter and opened it. After making sure there was no problem, he turned and handed it to Yi Li. Yi Li opened the letter and glanced at it. She looked up at Mo Fei who was standing leisurely in the hall and smiled faintly. She lowered her head and continued to read. After a while, she looked up and slowly folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope. She calmly looked at Mo Fei. Mo Fei smiled and said, Your Highness, what do you think about what your highness said by the prince? What do you think? Yi Li smiled and looked at him leisurely. She said slowly, come, drag this person out and behead him. Everyone was stunned. Yuan Pei looked at Feng Zhiyao. Chapter 323. A moment later, unbridled laughter sounded in the room. The tall man standing in the middle, dressed in the attire of an attendant, casually wiped his face. His ordinary appearance instantly changed. Genom of Gojoseon was in his early 50s this year. His appearance was 70 to 80% similar to Lei Tengfeng, but he had more grace and dominance. However, the way he looked at Yi Li made her feel extremely uncomfortable. As long as one was a man, they would be able to understand what that flash of light meant. Anger and killing intent flashed across the faces of Feng Zhiyao and the others. Yi Li was not angry. She had seen all kinds of people in her previous life. This degree was not enough for her to lose her cool. She looked indifferently at Genom of Gojoseon, who was laughing wildly, and did not speak. When Genom of Gojoseon finally seemed to have finished laughing, he walked to a chair at the side and sat down. Mo Fei and the other 3 stood respectfully behind him. Even though he was dressed in the attire of a servant, it was difficult to conceal his domineering aura. How did Wang Fei see through it? Such good eyesight. I admire you, Genom of Gojoseon said curiously. Yi Li smiled. Zhuo Jing, has this Fei ever taught you what the most important thing to do if you want to disguise yourself? Zhuo Jing replied in a low voice, ordinary and unremarkable. Unnoticeable. Genom of Gojoseon raised an eyebrow and said, I can't think of any flaws. Zhuo Jing looked at Genom of Gojoseon and then raised his head to look at Yi Li. Yi Li nodded slightly. Zhuo Jing said, a person with a disability is not suited to disguise himself. Everyone's gaze immediately focused on Genom of Gojoseon's left arm. Everyone knew that Genom of Gojoseon had been defeated by Mo Lufang more than a decade ago and had only managed to survive after losing an arm. Originally, No one had paid much attention to it, but now that their attention was focused on his arm, those with good eyesight immediately noticed that something was wrong. Genom of Gojosian had not moved his left arm. His left hand was hidden in his sleeve. Although the sleeves weren't empty, it still made people feel that they were too stiff if they took a closer look. After all, no matter what it was, even if the shape was the same, it could never replace the texture of a real arm. Genom of Gojosian's expression hardened and the corners of his eyes twitched. Zhuo Jing's words had touched his sore spot. Being defeated by Mo Lufang was a shadow and humiliation that he would never be able to forget. However, Mo Lufang had been dead for a long time. In the eyes of the world, he would always be left with the impression that Lei Zhenting, the king of South guarding Xiling, was inferior to Mo Lufang. Therefore, he placed more importance on how to defeat the Mahist army and Mo Xiuyao. Because this was the only way he could wash away his humiliation. Good, Princess Ding's subordinates are truly capable. A moment later, Genom of Gojosian said in a deep voice. Yili nodded and smiled faintly. Prince praises me too much. Genom of Gojosian examined Yili and asked, just now, Princess Ding did not hesitate to reject Ai's letter. Will you reconsider now? Yili held her forehead, shook her head and sighed. I cannot find a reason to reconsider. Genom of Gojosian laughed brightly. Does Wang Fei think that I is not as good as Mo Xiuyao? Yili tilted her head and thought for a moment. Then she shook her head and said, how can that be? At least Prince is older than our prince. Genom of Gojosian's eyes flashed. As expected, Wang Fei is not an ordinary woman. What if I say that as long as Wang Fei follows I will immediately withdraw my troops from Dongchu? Impudence. Yuan Pei was furious. He slapped the table and stood up, glaring angrily at Genom of Gojosian. The expressions of the others were not good either. Yili raised a hand to stop Yuan Pei. She smiled faintly and said, for Prince to say this, does he think that Yili's brain is not good? Genom of Gojosian raised an eyebrow and asked in confusion, why does Wang Fei say this? Yili laughed coldly and said, Xiling's army of hundreds of thousands has invaded our Dechu state and finally reached Jiangxia. It would not be easy for Prince to withdraw his troops now, right? Besides, I feel that rather than humiliating the country in exchange for Prince's withdrawal, it would be more convenient to directly exchange for Prince. Does Prince agree? Hearing this, the expressions of the Xiling's followers changed. The man who looked like a general pulled out his sword with a clang and stood in front of Genom of Gojosian to protect him. Yili raised an eyebrow and smiled without speaking. Genom of Gojosian raised his hand and pressed down on the weapon in his subordinate's hand. He said, everyone in this room is an expert. Princess Ding is willing to let you bring your sword in. This means that she is confident that your sword is not a threat. Put it down. That person looked at Yili with some reluctance. In the end, he obeyed Genom of Gojosian's orders and put away the sword in his hand. Seeing that he was about to become a prisoner, Genom of Gojosian was clearly not in a hurry. As the host, Yili was naturally not in a hurry. She sat leisurely and drank tea. After a while, Genom of Gojosian sighed and said, even though I took a risk by coming here today, seeing Wang Fei, I feel that this trip was not in vain. What are Wang Fei's plans? Yili put down her teacup and said, I have said that the others can leave, but I invite Prince to stay for a few days. Genom of Gojosian shook his head and said, I am busy with military affairs. I am afraid that I will have to disappoint Wang Fei's good intentions. No matter. If Prince feels that you can break out of Jiangxia with just the few of you, then feel free. As you wish. Genom of Gojosian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He raised his head and said with a smile, how about this, I have someone that Wang Fei might be interested in. This person can be considered a meeting gift for Wang Fei. Yili raised an eyebrow. Her heart moved slightly, but her expression did not change as she looked at him calmly. Genom of Gojoseon did not beat around the bush and said bluntly, "The southern Marquis Shitzi, I heard that he is Wang Fei's brother-in-law." "The southern Marquis Shitzi is in Prince of Gojoseon's hands?" Genom of Gojoseon smiled but did not speak. Yili asked, "How can I trust Prince of Gojoseon?" Genom of Gojoseon said, "I can let Wang Fei meet him first." Seeing him like this, Yili knew that there was an 80% chance that the southern Marquis Shitzi was in Genom of Gojoseon's hands. The same question arose. Should she use Genom of Gojoseon to exchange for the southern Marquis Shitzi? After a long silence, Yili finally raised her head and said, "All right, when I see the southern Marquis Shitzi, this Fei will immediately let Prince of Gojoseon out of the city. It's a deal." She sent people to take Genom of Gojoseon and the others away. The study instantly exploded. Yuan Pei anxiously asked, "Wang Fei, using Genom of Gojoseon to exchange for the southern Marquis Shitzi, isn't it too?" Everyone could see that this was definitely a losing trade. The southern Marquis Shitzi and Genom of Gojoseon were too different in terms of weight. Yili smiled as she looked at Feng Zhiyao and asked, "Feng-san, what do you think?" Feng Zhiyao used his fan to point at his chin and thought for a while before saying, "Genom of Gojoseon cannot be killed. Once Genom of Gojoseon dies, Jiangxia and the places occupied by Xiling will definitely incur Xiling's bloody revenge. Also, the Genom of Gojoseon's Shitzi, Lei Tengfeng, who is stationed in Xinyang, is also not an easy character to deal with. If he crazily attacks Jiangxia to avenge his father, we may not be able to hold on. Also, once Genom of Gojoseon dies, the current balance between the three countries and the imperial court's opinion towards the Mahist army will undergo an unpredictable change. At that time, we. Also, although the southern Marquis has always been neutral and does not like to involve himself in worldly affairs, he still has some power in the imperial court and the military. If we save the southern Marquis Shitzi, even if the Ding Palace does not have an additional ally, at least they will not be enemies." Chapter 324. Yuan Pei wasn't someone who didn't know the ways of the world. Hearing Feng Zhiyao say this, he thought for a moment before nodding. This general has not thought it through. "Wang Fei, please forgive this general." Yili shook her head and said, "If we can kill Genom of Gojoseon, that would be the best. It is a pity that we haven't made the preparations yet. Let him keep his head on his neck for a few days." Everyone couldn't help but laugh when they heard this. Yili quickly put away her smile and said seriously, "Let's discuss how to get the Nan Marquis Shitzi back. Qin Feng, I'll leave Genom of Gojoseon to you." Qin Feng nodded and said, "Wang Fei, do not worry. I guarantee that not even a strand of hair will be able to touch Genom of Gojoseon." When the Nan Marquis received the news of his son, he almost immediately ran over to see Yili without caring that he was seriously ill in bed. After he understood what had happened, the Nan Marquis pushed aside the people who were supporting him. He knelt on the ground and respectfully bowed to Yili, saying, "Wang Fei's great kindness, the Nan Marquis Fu will never forget. Wang Fei, please accept this old man's bow." Yili stilled and hurriedly left the table to personally help the Nan Marquis up. "Marquis, don't do this. Ben Fei doesn't dare. Not to mention the identity of the Nan Marquis Shitzi, Ben Fei can't not save him for De Jie's sake." The Nan Marquis was in tears. Even though the Nan Marquis Shitzi was not the only son of the Nan Marquis Fu, but he was the only son of the Nan Marquis. He was the only heir of the Nan Marquis Fu that could support the entire family. If something happened to him, they could only adopt a successor from the cadet branches. But there weren't any outstanding candidates in the cadet branches. The Nan Marquis Fu would probably only be able to last until the Marquis generation. Quan is useless. He was defeated and captured. He has caused trouble for Wang Fei. It was not a good reputation to be defeated and captured. Marquis Nan did not wish for his son to have outstanding achievements or great power. He only hoped that he could return alive and leave behind some descendants for the Marquis Nan's residence. Yili comforted him softly, victory and defeat are common in war. Genom of Gojosian of West Hill is known as the god of war of West Hill. It's not shameful for the southern Marquis heir to be defeated by him. As long as he's still alive, he'll win one day. Marquis Nan solemnly thanked her. This old man thanks Princess. Genom of Gojosian had been detained by Jiangxia City in exchange for the southern Marquis heir. This kind of transaction was obviously very advantageous for the West Hill, so after receiving the letter, the West Hill barracks almost immediately agreed without any hesitation. After all, Genom of Gojosian was the commander-in-chief of the Shilling army. If anything happened to him, not only would the Shilling army be leaderless, but the West Hill barracks would also be in chaos. And the southern Marquis heir was just a Marquis heir. Even if the southern Marquis had some prestige in the Chu capital, to the Dechu state army, the southern Marquis heir, who had just entered the battlefield, would have less influence on the Mahist army than a captain. This kind of transaction was unbelievably easy. Both sides quickly made preparations for the exchange of hostages. The location of the exchange was set to be 3 days later in a small valley 5 miles outside of Jiangxia City. Yili only brought Qin Feng and Zhuo Jing, as well as a few specially trained soldiers under Qin Feng and a dozen shadow guard. Even though he was a prisoner, Genom of Gojosian was still as elegant as ever. He was not in a sorry state as a hostage. When he saw Yili, he was even in a good mood and smiled at her. Yili did not pay attention to him. She waved her hand and had people take him away. Compared to Genom of Gojosian, the southern Marquis heir's situation was clearly much worse. The southern Marquis heir was dragged out from behind by the West Hill people. He was covered in wounds and looked tired and dispirited. The leader of the West Hill people was actually the heir of Genom of Gojosian, Leitingfeng, whom she had met several times in West Hill. It was obvious that he had rushed over from Xinyang overnight after receiving the news. Seeing Yili also sitting on a horse, he paused and said with a smile, "Wang Fei, how have you been since we last met?" Yili raised her eyebrows and said indifferently, "Not bad. I could have been very good. It's a pity that the heir and your country refused to give me this opportunity." Lei Tingfeng laughed and said, "Fighting on the battlefield is a man's business. With your status as a princess, you should be living a life of luxury. Why should you meddle in this mundane world?" Yili sighed and said, "I am a mundane person. How can I be detached from the mundane world? Heir Lei, let's stop chatting here. May I ask what is the current situation of the southern Marquis heir?" Lei Tingfeng turned to look at the southern Marquis heir who was being held behind him. He smiled apologetically at Yili and said, "Swords have no eyes on the battlefield. The southern Marquis heir is inevitably injured. I hope Wang Fei will not blame him." Yili smiled faintly and said, "I don't blame him. I understand now. Heir Lei is reminding me that I am too lenient with the captive. Shuo Jing." She raised her slender hand slightly and made a simple gesture. Zhuo Jing responded and moved like the wind. There were 2 cracking sounds and a scream came from behind. Mo Fei, who was standing beside Genom of Gojosian, had his left arm bent strangely and drooped down. Lei Tingfeng's expression changed slightly. He stared at Yili in front of him like lightning. Yili's expression was normal. She tilted her head and looked at the surprised Genom of Gojosian. She smiled at Lei Tingfeng and said, "Heir, I don't like to mistreat the captive. But I have always believed in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This time, I will let Sir Mo do it for me. If there is a chance in the future, I don't mind returning the favor to Genom of Gojosian. Or, have the heir's injuries healed?" Lei Tingfeng was silent for a moment. He ordered the people beside him, "Send Marquis Nan's heir over." 2 soldiers helped Nan's heir over to Yili's side. Yili waved her hand and said, "For the sake of fairness, send Genom of Gojosian over." Qin Feng nodded. The 2 people behind him, one on the left and one on the right, led Genom of Gojosian to the opposite side. When they reached the middle, the 2 sides exchanged places. Just as the two hostages returned to their own sides, Lei Tengfeng's deep voice suddenly came from the opposite side, "Do it." Before his voice died away, Genom of Gojoseon quickly retreated. The two soldiers shot forward like arrows. One of them pounced on Nan's heir while the other pounced on Yili. At the same time, more than 10 figures beside Lei Tengfeng also pounced quickly. They were accompanied by a rain of arrows. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. The two Dechu state soldiers standing in the middle flashed in front of Nan's heir. Before the West Hill soldier pouncing on Nan's heir could reach him, he felt a chill in his chest. He fell to the ground with an expression of disbelief. The other person did not stop the person running toward Yili. Instead, he pounced on Genom of Gojoseon who was retreating. The soldier who had dealt with the West Hill soldier did not pay any more attention to Nan's heir. Instead, he pounced on Genom of Gojoseon with his companion not far away. After this sudden change, Nan's heir also reacted. He ignored the wounds on his body and chased after them. Genom of Gojoseon clearly did not expect that the two seemingly ordinary Eastern Chu soldiers beside him would have such strong skills. Moreover, their coordination was almost flawless. However, Genom of Gojoseon was one of the top experts in the world. Even though he had lost an arm, he was still a top expert. Naturally, he was not afraid of these soldiers. However, these soldiers were clearly different from the Eastern Chu soldiers that Genom of Gojoseon knew. They were clearly very good at dealing with this kind of top expert. Just as they had exchanged a few moves, a few more people came forward and surrounded him. However, they did not lose their composure because of the large number of people. They still cooperated with each other as if they had practiced this thousands of times. Chapter 325. Yi Li's shadow guard also quickly fought with the West Hill people. With just a few glances, Yi Li could tell that although these people were wearing West Hill soldiers' uniforms, they were not real soldiers. They were more like Jianghu masters. Yi Li looked up at Lei Tengfeng, who was also looking at her. She smiled coldly and said, "Kill. As you command." The shadow guard and the soldiers who came with her immediately became excited. They sharpened their swords and charged at the West Hill people. Soon, the two sides were engaged in a fierce battle. It was difficult for two fists to fight against four hands. This principle was once again proven by Qin Feng's specially trained soldiers. When the fighting was coming to an end, Genom of Gojoseon was once again a captive of the Dechu state. Looking at Genom of Gojoseon who was brought back, Yi Li raised her eyebrows in a good mood. Genom of Gojoseon's smile was a rare bitterness. The Mahist army is well trained. I admire you. Yi Li smiled and said, Prince is too polite. The prince is one of the few masters in the world. It is their fortune to be able to receive guidance from the prince. Yi Li's eyes were filled with satisfaction as she pointed at the soldiers who had just defeated another expert of that era. Although everyone was injured, the soldiers' morale was high. After hearing Yi Li's words, they raised their heads and puffed out their chests. They saluted Genom of Gojoseon and said, "Thank you for your guidance, Genom of Gojoseon." To be honest, even if Genom of Gojoseon only had one arm, he was still more difficult to deal with than Mu Qingsong, who was known as the Dechu state's #1 master. Just by looking at everyone's injuries, it was obvious that if they didn't already have the experience of defeating Mu Qingsong, it would be even more difficult to defeat Genom of Gojoseon. This was because Genom of Gojoseon respected his status and did not fight to the death with them. Otherwise, it would be hard to avoid casualties. Genom of Gojoseon's face twitched slightly. He looked at Yi Li and asked, "What are Princess Ding's plans now?" Yi Li said with a smile, "Prince is making things difficult for this consort. Wouldn't it be better for everyone to exchange hostages peacefully and return home? But now, what should I do?" On the other side, Lei Tengfeng smiled bitterly and said, "Wang Fei, this matter is this lowly prince's fault. Wang Fei, please be magnanimous and let Wang Fei go." Yi Li said indifferently, "Shitzi speaks lightly. If it was the southern Marquis Shitsi or this consort who was injured, what would Shitsi's attitude be right now? Lei Tengfeng knew he was in the wrong. He sighed and said, as long as this lowly prince can do it, Wang Fei, please do not hesitate to ask. Today, he had been too reckless. He thought that Yi Li would not have made any preparations. He didn't think that Yi Li's arrangements were waiting for him to make a move. Yi Li thought for a moment and asked, how about Shitsi lead the army out of Dechu state? Lei Tengfeng's expression darkened slightly. He said, Wang Fei is making things difficult for this lowly prince. Yi Li raised her eyebrows and looked somewhat helplessly at Genom of Gojoseon. She said, Prince, so a mere Xinyang city isn't even worth it. Is Shiling's Genom of Gojoseon so cheap? Genom of Gojoseon smiled faintly and said, to take Xinyang, Shiling sacrificed countless soldiers. This matter is not something my son can decide. Wang Fei is making things difficult for him. Yi Li narrowed her eyes slightly and quickly said, all right, this consort will not make things difficult for him. 50,000 dan of grain and 5 million taels of silver. Wang Fei is speaking too carelessly. Lei Tengfeng frowned. Yi Li snorted coldly and said sternly, cut off Genom of Gojoseon's other hand. Zhuo Jing nodded and said, as you command. Seeing that Zhuo Jing had indeed pulled out his sword from the soldier behind him and was about to swing it at Genom of Gojoseon, Lei Tengfeng hurriedly stopped him. Wang Fei, please wait. Yi Li raised her eyebrows and looked at him indifferently. After a while, Lei Tengfeng finally nodded and said, all right, it's a deal. But this lowly prince needs time. Also, Wang Fei must guarantee that father will not be harmed in any way. Otherwise, this lowly prince will slaughter all the people of East Chu wherever the army goes. Yi Li's smile became even colder. In 5 days, it will still be here. Also, Shitsi Lei had better not be joking. Otherwise, this consort does not mind killing all the generals of Xiling. For example, Zheng Bian. Of course, this consort does not mind slaughtering all of Xiling. Lei Tengfeng's heart trembled. He looked deeply at Yi Li and nodded. It's a deal. When they returned to Jiangxia, Yi Li waved her hand and had people take Genom of Gojoseon and the others away. She took Marquis Nan Shitsi to see Marquis Nan, who had been anxiously waiting. Seeing his son come back covered in injuries, Marquis Nan was pleasantly surprised and distressed. He looked his son up and down and did not forget to ask him where he was injured. Marquis Nan Shitsi probably did not expect that he would have the chance to see his parents again in this life. His eyes reddened. He broke free from Marquis Nan's hand and knelt on the ground. He said in a low voice, this child has embarrassed father. Marquis Nan pulled him up and said tearfully, silly child, it's good that you're back. Why are you still talking about this? It's good that you're back. After the initial joy, Marquis Nan remembered that Yi Li and the others were still present. He quickly wiped his tears and pulled his son. It's all thanks to Wang Fei that you can come back safely. Quickly thank Wang Fei for saving your life. Marquis Nan Shitsi stepped forward and bowed. Many thanks to Wang Fei for saving my life. Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled. Brother-in-law, you don't have to be so formal. We're family. Did brother-in-law do anything wrong? Did the people of Xiling hurt you? Marquis Nan and his son looked at each other. Marquis Nan Shitsi shook his head and smiled. It's just a small injury. Many thanks. Third sister for your concern. If you need anything in the future, just tell me. The Nan Marquis residence will definitely help you. Yi Li smiled and thanked him. She knew that even if the Nan Marquis residence could not help the Prince Ding mansion in the future, they would definitely not become the enemy of the Prince Ding mansion. This time, Lei Tengfeng did not play any tricks. 5 days later, at the same time, at the same place, 50,000 dan of rations and 5 million taels of silver were delivered to Yi Li. Yi Li also kept her promise and released Genom of Gojoseon. Genom of Gojoseon returned to Shiling's camp. He turned his head and looked deeply at Yi Li. I was too arrogant. Wang Fei has won this round. Princess Ding, we still have a long time ahead of us. Yi Li smiled sweetly and said, Prince is joking. How can I dare to say that I have won against Prince? I was just lucky. Genom of Gojoseon's expression became slightly subservient. He turned around and left. She was neither arrogant in victory nor discouraged in defeat. Wang Fei, a woman, had easily won a large amount of rations and silver from Shiling. However, she did not show any arrogance on her face. As expected, she was not someone an ordinary woman could compare to. Yi Li watched as Genom of Gojoseon's figure disappeared into the Shiling army. She turned around and said to Feng Zhiyao, pass down the order, the entire army is on guard. Feng Zhiyao raised his eyebrows in confusion. Yi Li said indifferently, after suffering such a big loss, how can Genom of Gojoseon not take revenge? Wang Fei, Xinyang has been reclaimed by our army. A soldier rushed in with a face full of joy. Yi Li was stunned. What did you say? The soldier raised his head and said loudly, news just came from the front. Prince led 100,000 troops down from the north and defeated Shiling's northern army. Last night, they reclaimed Xinyang. Xiuyao is back. Prince is back. Yi Li and Feng Zhiyao looked at each other and saw the ecstasy in each other's eyes. Yi Li gathered her thoughts and said loudly, return to the city. Chapter 326. Leng Qingyu gritted his teeth and finally said firmly, I beg Prince to accept me. I am willing to be a pawn as long as I can defeat the Wiling people. After returning to the capital, I am willing to die to atone for my sins. Mo Xiuyao looked at him indifferently and said indifferently after a while, in that case, I will fulfill your wish. After dismissing everyone, only Feng Zhiyao and Zhuo Jing were left in the study. Mo Xiuyao leaned against the couch and looked at the two of them silently, one hand tapping the armrest casually. The study was silent. After a long time, his voice rang out in the study. Feng San, what happened in the capital after I left? Feng Zhiyao naturally wouldn't hide anything for Mo Jingqi and hurriedly told him everything that had happened after Mo Xiuyao left the capital, adding fuel to the fire. Although Zhuo Jing always liked to have a cold face in front of others, he spared no effort in speaking ill of people who intended to harm his master. Hearing this, Mo Xiuyao's originally unpleasant expression became even gloomier. Mo Xiuyao was really angry. Not only because Mo Jingqi had set his sights on Li Li, but also because he didn't know the severity of the matter as the emperor. In Mo Xiuyao's opinion, the tens of thousands of soldiers and the lives of all the people in Xinyang were lost because of Mo Jingqi's suspicion and narrow-mindedness. Mo Xiuyao once wondered if the ancestors of the Ding royal estate were too meddlesome, which caused the emperor to be so wary of the Ding royal estate. Now he truly understood that it wasn't that the ancestors of the Ding royal estate didn't know how to overshadow their master, nor that they didn't know how to avoid the emperor's suspicion. It was that some things had to be done even though they knew they couldn't be done. Good, very good. Mo Xiuyao laughed softly, but his deep laughter made Feng Zhiyao shiver for no reason. Mo Xiuyao looked up and said to the two of them, you can go back first. This subordinate will take his leave. When Yi Li stepped into the study, it was already midnight. Although she had just woken up and was a little angry at Mo Xiuyao's unscrupulous behavior, she couldn't help but walk out of the room to take a look when she realized that he wasn't in the room. Seeing that the light in the study was still on, Yi Li knew that he must still be working in the study. After thinking about it, she couldn't bear to see him like this. She turned around and went to the kitchen to make some supper and brought it into the study. In the study, Mo Xiuyao was hunched over his desk, furiously writing. When he heard the sound at the door, he raised his head and saw the woman at the door wearing a plain cloak. Her hair was casually tied up, and she held a tray full of food in her hands as she looked at him quietly. The light shone on her beautiful face, making her inconceivably beautiful and gentle. Mo Xiaoyao's heart warmed, this was his wife. Li, come. Mo Xiaoyao put down his pen and stood up, reaching out his hand to Yi Li walked up and placed the tray on the table. She put away the various files on the table and laid out the food as she said, is there anything that can't be done tomorrow? Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly, pulling Yi Li to sit on his lap and said, Li, eat with me. Because he didn't want to disturb Li Li's rest, he only ate a few mouthfuls of dinner, so he was a little hungry now. Yi Li was a little speechless as she looked at him. How was she going to eat while sitting in his embrace? Mo Xiaoyao pretended not to see her conflicted expression. He scooped up a spoonful of porridge and a refreshing side dish and brought it to Yi Li's mouth. Yi Li hesitated for a moment, but seeing that he stubbornly refused to take his hand back, she could only lower her head and eat. Mo Xiaoyao smiled with satisfaction, and then ate 2 more mouthfuls himself. Just like that, the two of them finished the food on the table 1 spoon at a time. When she saw the empty plates on the table, Yi Li could only twitch her mouth, speechless. After eating supper, Mo Xiaoyao called for the servants to take away the bowls and chopsticks. He didn't let go of Yi Li, and just kept her in his embrace. The two of them looked at the reports on the table, exchanging opinions from time to time. When Yi Li saw the statistics of the people who had been massacred in Sun Creed City, she lowered her head sadly. I'm very sorry. This time, it's all my fault. Mo Xiaoyao sighed softly. He lifted her small face and kissed her softly. Li, you've already done very well. You've done even better than I imagined. Mo Xiaoyao was speaking the truth. Even though he had given the command of the Mahist army to Yi Li, Mo Xiaoyao wasn't too sure how much Yi Li could control. After all, the heavy responsibility of controlling an army of hundreds of thousands wasn't something that many men could do, even if they were men. But his Li had really done the best she could. But, if I hadn't ordered people to divert Sun Creed City's food and money, perhaps Sun Creed City wouldn't have been massacred, Yi Li said softly. Mo Xiaoyao shook his head and said lightly, Li, don't take everything on yourself. You and I both know that you didn't do anything wrong. Even though Xiling is as vast as Dechu State, it's different from Dechu State's fertile land. Xiling has large areas of desert, and the cultivated land isn't even 1/5 that of Dechu State's. In Sun Creed City, there's enough food and military supplies to support an army of 500,000 for half a year. Once they get their hands on this batch of food and money, this war will become even more difficult. Also, when Xiling's soldiers invaded Dechu State, they didn't kill the common people not because they didn't want to, but because they were worried that the people would resist. Once this war drags on into winter, has Li read the history of Xiling's wars? Yi Li shook her head. In the past, she didn't care about these things. After marrying Mo Xiaoyao, too many things had happened. In reality, she didn't have much time to read books. Mo Xiaoyao said, if Li has read it, you'll know that once the Xiling army runs out of food, they will quickly attack the common people. In reality, the Xiling army has always thought of themselves as tyrannical. Xiling doesn't produce food, so their food supplies have never been sufficient. To them, the common people of the enemy country are just a backup source of food. Even though Dechu State hasn't been harmed before, the western countries, and even the southern border, have all had their cities massacred by Xiling. If Xiling gets their hands on Sun Creed City's food, this war will drag on even longer. Once winter arrives, the food supplies will run out, and more people will be harmed. Besides, even if someone is to be blamed, the first to be blamed is the people who failed to defend the city. Yi Li leaned into his thick embrace. Even though she knew that Mo Xiaoyao was comforting her, she still felt much more relaxed. Yi Li wasn't one to dwell on insignificant issues, so she quickly put this matter aside. She lowered her head to look at the shocking numbers on the memorial and sighed. War was always accompanied by the loss of countless common people's innocent lives. This made one feel both heartache and helpless. The two of them huddled under the lamp and talked about various things that happened after they parted. After Mo Xiaoyao heard Genom of Gojoseon's various things, his face immediately darkened. He hugged Yi Li and said softly, Li Li is too soft-hearted. Asking him for tens of thousands of dan of food and a few million taels of silver is too cheap for him. If it were I would just break his other hand and be done with it. Yi Li raised her head and looked amusedly at the strangely childish man in front of her. She said, if that's the case, I'm afraid that we and Xiling will not rest until one of us is dead. Haven't we communicated with the Emperor of Xiling? Mo Xiaoyao shook his head and said helplessly, I'm afraid that the Emperor of Xiling won't be of much use. Whether he can live past this year is another matter. Once the Emperor of Xiling dies, I'm afraid there will be another young emperor. The military and political power of Xiling will completely fall into the hands of Genom of Gojoseon. Chapter 327. Yi Li sighed with some melancholy. If that is really the case, we should have cut off his other hand as well. With that, the two looked at each other and smiled. In the end, a joke was just a joke. In the current situation, if they really fought to the death with the West Hill, it would not benefit them or the Great Chu at all. Mo Xiaoyao held the beautiful person in his arms. His warm gaze fell on the booklet on the table and flashed with a frightening cold light. Genom of Gojoseon, he dared to covet the princess of the Ding kingdom. Father had been too merciful when he only cut off one of his hands. Mo Xiaoyao's sudden return caused the Xiling army, which had been advancing like a hot knife through butter, to stop in their tracks. But this kind of calm could not last for long. A few days later, the flames of war reignited. Although Xinyang had been retaken, including the north and south armies of Xiling, there were still 5 cities in the northwest of Dechu state. Almost a third of the northwest land had fallen into the hands of the Xiling people. Because Mo Xiaoyao had led his army to break through the blockade of the North Army and head straight for Xinyang, although Xinyang had been retaken, the surrounding areas were still occupied by the Xiling people. The entire city of Xinyang was surrounded by enemies on 3 sides. Although the city did not lack for food and military supplies, water was still a huge problem. Even though there were very few people left in the city, there was still a shortage of water for hundreds of thousands of people. It was not that Mo Xiaoyao did not know about this problem, but the Dechu state really needed an encouraging piece of news to rouse the monarch and calm the people. Retaking Xinyang was the best choice. After Mo Xiaoyao returned, Yi Li naturally returned the original military affairs to him. She only helped him with some trivial matters and instantly had a lot of free time. While the people that Lin Han had led to follow Mo Xiaoyao to the northern tribes and the people that Qin Feng had led to gather information had all returned, Yi Li remembered something that had been delayed for a long time. She picked Mo Xiaoyao and found him when he was free. Originally, there were 63 people who had been trained under Black Cloud Peak. Now, there were only 51 people here. The sacrifice of 12 people was negligible in other armies, but here, it was equivalent to losing almost 1/6 of their fighting power. This subordinate greets His Highness and Her Highness. Mo Xiaoyao nodded. Rise. On the trip to the northern tribes, Mo Xiaoyao had truly seen the fighting power of the people trained by Yi Li. At the same time, he became curious about this team. Thank you, Princess. Mo Xiaoyao smiled and nodded at Yi Li. Yi Li stood up and said, thank you for your hard work this time. Lin Han, Qin Feng, report the progress of each group. Lin Han stepped forward and said, Princess, of the 8 people who went to the northern tribes this time, 1 died in battle, 1 was seriously injured. The remaining 6 all passed. Qin Feng also stepped forward and said, Princess, 55 people were divided into 11 groups. 1 group failed, 7 died in battle, and 3 were injured. Yi Li nodded slightly and said, Zhuo Jing will take care of the funeral arrangements for the soldiers who died in battle and the injured. Now, everyone here is the last batch of people who passed this special training. Thank you for your hard work. I have already discussed this with the prince. From today onwards, you will be officially incorporated into the Mahist army and will be personally commanded by the prince and me. Codename, Qi Lin. Yi Li showed a jade pendant in her hand. It was very similar to the Yazi jade pendant that could command the entire Mahist army. However, the carving on it was a lifelike Qi Lin. At the same time, this would be their name from today onwards. From today onwards, they were Qi Lin. Yi Li smiled and looked at the soldiers in front of her. Although they tried to appear calm, their eyes were still filled with excitement. She said in a low voice, "Everyone, what is Qi Lin?" Everyone hesitated for a moment before someone answered, "Princess, Qi Lin is an auspicious beast." Yi Li nodded and said, "That's right. Qi Lin is an auspicious beast. Qi Lin is not only an auspicious beast, but also a benevolent beast. Qi Lin has horns on its head and meat on its horns. It is a benevolent beast. I also hope that you can become a benevolent beast that protects the common people. When necessary, you can also be a sharp sword that stabs the enemy." Everyone said in unison, "We will follow princess instructions." Mo Xiaoyao also said a few words of encouragement. Qin Feng and Lin Han stayed behind before letting everyone leave. When they returned to the study and sat down, Yi Li looked at Lin Han and asked, "How was the trip to the northern tribes?" Lin Han replied respectfully, "Everything went smoothly. Please rest assured, princess." Yi Li nodded, looked sideways at Mo Xiaoyao and asked, "Princess Ronghua?" Mo Xiaoyao said softly, "Although Princess Ronghua is a little capricious, she is not a fool. Li, don't worry. She won't ruin it." Yi Li nodded and sighed softly, "That's good. Otherwise, this trip will be a big loss." Qin Feng stood aside and listened to the conversation between the two silently. Since the princess and the prince did not avoid him, it meant that they trusted him. He personally participated in the training of the first group of Qi Lin members, so he was very familiar with everyone. He naturally knew who the 8 people that Lin Han brought out were and who came back. Mo Xiaoyao looked at Yi Li with a smile and said, "I haven't asked about Princess Li before." This time, on the trip to the northern tribes, I learned that Princess Li is not only in charge of the prince's mansion, but also in the battlefield. She is also very good at training soldiers. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, even Mo Xiaoyao would have found it hard to believe that such an army and soldiers existed in the world. It wasn't that their martial arts were very strong, nor was it that they were good at fighting. It was that they had mastered various skills on the battlefield, and their accuracy was shocking. Mo Xiaoyao even thought that if such an army really appeared, how terrible it would be. Yi Li glanced at him and said, "These training methods use too much manpower and resources, and have high demands on the soldiers themselves. Using them on the battlefield with thousands of soldiers and horses does not have much practical use. It can be said that the losses do not outweigh the gains." No one had been eliminated in this first training. But that was because these people were the best of the best, and many of them had been eliminated during the selection process. More importantly, this was the first time in this era that Yi Li was training the soldiers she wanted. Because many of the equipment and the fighting methods of the two eras were different, this time could only be considered an exploration. It was hard to say that these people met Yi Li's requirements. Mo Xiaoyao did not blink and looked with a smile at Yi Li. "Does Princess Li have any suggestions?" Yi Li blinked and looked at Mo Xiaoyao for a long time without saying anything. After a while, she said in a low voice, "Give me some time to think." Mo Xiaoyao did not care. It was fine as long as he achieved his goal. If Princess Li was not interested in these things, then he would hope that she would just be a leisurely Ding country Wang Fei. But since Princess Li was interested and had the ability, he would not block her light. After dealing with Mo Xiaoyao, Yi Li turned to say to Qin Feng, "Starting today, you are the commander of Qi Lin. In the future, these people will be given to you." Qin Feng nodded and said, "This subordinate will not betray Wang Fei's trust." Yi looked at him and said, "Your Highness, don't speak nonsense. I've never looked down on the Shadow Guards. There were many people in the Shadow Guard with extraordinary abilities. At most, she just felt that it was a waste of talent for the Prince Ding mansion to use people like this." Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyebrows and thought for a moment before saying, "Since Li Li intends to increase the number of people in Qilin, after returning to the capital, let all the Shadow Guard participate in Qilin's special training. In the future, the Ding King's palace will cancel the Shadow Guard system. Is this good?" Yi Li was also worried about Mo Xiaoyao's quick decision, especially when she thought of a certain eccentric Shadow Guard commander. After knowing Mo Xiaoyao's decision, Mo Hua probably had the heart to eat her. Mo Xiaoyao smiled and played with her hair. "What's not good about it? Since there's a more advantageous method, why not use it?" Yi Li said, "Isn't the Shadow Guard specially used to protect the master of the Prince Ding mansion?" Mo Xiaoyao smiled and said, "Didn't you also say that Qilin's mission also included protection? And this time, they did very well in the northern tribes. It was indeed very good. The people trained by Yi Li could fight and kill, speak eloquently, act dumb, disguise themselves, use poison, and gather information." Yi Li was a little speechless as she looked at him. So this was his plan. Prince really knows how to scheme. Yi Li glanced at him unhappily. In Mo Xiaoyao's eyes, this look was coquettish and flirtatious. His heart moved as he reached out to pull her into his arms and leaned over to kiss her. Their lips and tongues intertwined. Yi Li was kissed until she almost couldn't breathe. Mo Xiaoyao's large palms made her beautiful face turn red and her body go limp. Ever since he returned from the northern tribes, Mo Xiaoyao had obviously changed a lot compared to the past. These changes made Yi Li happy, but occasionally, she couldn't bear it. "Oh, bastard Mo Xiaoyao, will you die if you don't go into heat?" Mo Xiaoyao chuckled. His cool lips moved around her slender neck and his warm breath made Yi Li's face turn even redder. "Bastard Mo Xiaoyao." Yi Li's clear eyes narrowed. She raised her hand and wanted to hit him. Mo Xiaoyao seemed to have expected this move. He raised his hand and gently caressed it. "Yi Li, don't you feel hurt if you hit me?" Yi Li rolled her eyes. She raised her head and touched Mo Xiaoyao's forehead. Mo Xiaoyao looked at her and raised his eyebrows in confusion. Yi Li calmly said, "You don't have a fever. You're dreaming in the middle of the day." Mo Xiaoyao was stunned when he heard this. He leaned on Yi Li's shoulder and laughed. After a while, he raised his head and said gently, "Yi Li is so cruel. Even if Yi Li doesn't care about me, your husband will worry about Yi Li's hand hurting." Yi Li was powerless. She was not used to Mo Xiaoyao's sudden mushy behavior. In the past, Mo Xiaoyao would occasionally joke with her, calling her wife as her husband. But after coming back this time, Mo Xiaoyao had obviously become more fond of sticking to her side. Sitting in Mo Xiaoyao's arms, Yi Li softly asked, "Xiaoyao, what's wrong?" Mo Xiaoyao was stunned. He smiled and said, "What do you mean what's wrong? Does Yi Li hate your husband?" Yi Li calmly looked at him. The smile on Mo Xiaoyao's face gradually faded. He once again pulled her into his arms and took a deep breath before saying, "Yi Li, I'm a little scared." Yi Li's heart trembled. Although Mo Xiaoyao had always been gentle and refined, but Yi Li knew very well what a proud man he was. If it wasn't because he could not take it, he would not show his weakness in front of anyone. No, even if it was because he could not take it, he would not show it in front of others. "What's wrong?" "When I heard about the bloody battle at the Ding Palace in the northern tribes, when I knew that you had to deal with Mo Jingqi and those greedy nobles, and that you had to lead the army to battle, I regretted. He regretted agreeing to go to the northern tribes with Mo Jingqi. He had insisted on not going, and Mo Jingqi had not dared to force him. He even regretted that he had not killed those people earlier. Every time he thought about the possibility of losing her, the fear and killing intent in his heart made him want to destroy everything in sight. Yi Li, luckily you're fine. Yi Li had never thought of herself as a soft-hearted person, but right now, her heart was as soft as a ball of cotton. This strong and powerful man had become so weak and afraid because of her. Yi Li had never been clearer about this than now. Gently wrapping her arms around his shoulders, Yi Li's voice was soft but firm. No, as long as I'm alive, I will always be by your side. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head, pressing his forehead against hers. Really? Yi Li said, as long as you don't leave, I will not abandon you. This was the most sincere vow she could make. Yi Li already knew that Mo Xiaoyao had done enough for her. She also knew that she could not bear for this man to suffer. Chapter 329. Never leave or abandon. Mo Xiaoyao murmured softly. He liked this phrase. The thought of never leaving Li made him happy from the bottom of his heart. Anyone who dared to stand in their way, he would make them pay the price. Shilin Camp. The atmosphere in the tent was gloomy and chilly. Genom of Gojoseon's expression was the ugliest it had ever been since Shilin sent out its troops. Ever since Mo Xiaoyao suddenly appeared to seize Xinyang, the entire army of Dechu state seemed to have suddenly come alive. In the short span of 10 days, the results of nearly a month's worth of battles seemed to have disappeared. Not only had the northern army been defeated by Mo Xiaoyao's surprise attack, the southern army had also met with setbacks. Only the south vanquishing king personally oversaw the central army, which was relatively stable. But how difficult would it be to take back Suncreed City from Mo Xiaoyao's hands again? Why did they have to lose 50,000 dan of rations and millions of taels of silver to Princess Ding? This made the Shilin army, which was already lacking in rations, even worse in the coming winter. Prince, please calm down. The generals said with some trepidation. Genom of Gojoseon snorted coldly and said, calm down, calm down. Do you not know how to say anything other than calm down? Knowing that the prince was in a fit of anger, the generals did not dare to speak. They could only look at Lei Tengfeng, who was sitting to the side, pleading for help. Lei Tengfeng smiled faintly. He stood up and said to Genom of Gojoseon, Father, we all know that Mo Xiaoyao is not easy to deal with. Father, please don't make things difficult for them. They have already done their best. Genom of Gojoseon snorted softly. He swept a cold glance over everyone and said, go back. If you are flustered by the Mahist army again tomorrow, you may as well take off your armor and become pawns. Everyone agreed and looked gratefully at Lei Tengfeng before leaving the tent dejectedly. Only Genom of Gojoseon and his son were left in the tent. There were no outsiders. Lei Tengfeng smiled and said, Father, we cannot rush to deal with Mo Xiaoyao. Even though we have suffered some losses these few days, we are not at a disadvantage in the current situation. Genom of Gojoseon sighed softly and said, I do not know this. But Tengfeng, do not underestimate Mo Xiaoyao. In I's opinion, Mo Xiaoyao is even more dangerous than Mo Lufang. Lei Tengfeng raised his eyebrows in surprise. He did not think that his father would have such a high opinion of Mo Xiaoyao, whom he had only met a few times. Mo Lufang was Mo Xiaoyao's father. His father's greatest enemy in this life could also be said to be his only enemy. As expected, the student has surpassed the master. If Mo Xiaoyao had been living peacefully these few years, I might not have valued him so much. But you also know what kind of life he has been living these few years, and what kind of injuries he suffered back then. But look at the performance of the Mahist army these few days. Mo Xiaoyao is not unfamiliar at all. He is even more experienced than the legends say. This means that even if Mo Xiaoyao was sick and did not leave the Ding King's residence, he still has the ability to completely control the Mahist army. Furthermore, the Mahist army is still wholeheartedly convinced by him. This. Tengfeng, are you able to do it? Genom of Gojoseon lightly asked. Lei Tengfeng slightly frowned and thought for a moment. Then he raised his head and his expression was somewhat serious. His smile carried some shame and unwillingness, but he still shook his head and said, "Your son is useless. I cannot do it." No one knew better than him how badly Mo Xiaoyao had been injured back then. He knew that under that kind of situation, he would definitely not be able to control the Mahist army as perfectly as Mo Xiaoyao. It was even possible that he would have been defeated by that kind of pain and torture, or become crazy from being swallowed by hatred. Genom of Gojoseon nodded and said with some relief, "It is a good thing to be able to clearly see your own shortcomings. Mo Lufang gave birth to a good son, and also a good wife. He really has a good life." Lei Tengfeng thought about the day of the exchange of hostages, the woman in white who was talking and laughing calmly. He could not help but admit that Mo Xiaoyao was indeed very lucky. Marrying such a woman as his wife, how many heroes in the world would envy Mo Xiaoyao to death? "What plans does father have?" Lei Tengfeng asked. Genom of Gojoseon raised his eyebrows and said, "What plans do you think father has?" Lei Tengfeng smiled and said, "Although father looked very angry on the surface, he was not truly angry. This means that father already has a plan in his heart. If father was truly angry, not to mention him pleading for leniency, even if the heavenly emperor came, it would be useless." Genom of Gojoseon casually played with the jade thumb ring on his hand and said with a cold smile, "That year, Mo Xiaoyao was lucky and the Ding royal estate was not destined to be destroyed. This time, I want to see if he is still so lucky." Lei Tengfeng's heart moved and his expression changed slightly. "Father, you plan to..." Genom of Gojoseon leisurely smiled and said, "The Ding royal estate is not only an eyesore to I, Prince is right. The Ding royal estate is indeed an eyesore to many people. In this world, there are many people who want it to disappear." A gentle voice came from outside the tent. Lei Tengfeng frowned when he heard this and a trace of disgust flashed across his face. Genom of Gojoseon saw this and shook his head in amusement. The curtain of the large tent was lifted from the outside and a slender and graceful figure walked in. Passing through the screen of the tiger-roaring forest, the woman who appeared in the large tent was wearing a pink palace dress. Her eyebrows were dark and her lips were red without makeup. Her appearance was so exquisite that there was not a single flaw to be found. Her sparkling eyes moved and brought along a little starlight that made people intoxicated. Even though Lei Tengfeng seemed to hate her, when she looked over, he could not help but be dazed for a moment. Seeing Lei Tengfeng being dazed, the woman's lips curled into a smile. She slowly walked forward and bowed, "Greetings to Prince, heir." Genom of Gojoseon looked at her indifferently and asked, "Why are you here? Doesn't the emperor need someone?" The woman rolled her eyes and said with a smile, "Prince, you must be joking. The emperor is now seriously ill in bed. The empress is enough. Why would he need me to serve him? Don't tell me. Prince doesn't want to see me." Genom of Gojoseon said with a smile, "How can that be? You've come at the right time. I need your help." The woman's smile became even more joyful. With her smile, the originally solemn tent suddenly seemed to become a little more colorful. "Prince, Long will do her best to fulfill the prince's orders." This woman was Bai Long, imperial concubine Qingrong of West Hill. She was also the first beauty of Dechu State, Su Zuodi. Lei Tengfeng's absent-mindedness only lasted for a moment. As soon as Genom of Gojoseon spoke, he had already regained his senses. He just listened to the conversation between the two in silence. His eyes were still full of disgust and disdain when he glanced at Su Zuodi, as if he was looking at something dirty. However, there seemed to be something deeper struggling in the depths of his eyes. Genom of Gojoseon had been paying attention to his son's expression since the beginning of the conversation. Seeing him like this, he sighed slightly in his heart. Tengfeng was indeed the most outstanding child among all his children, even among the emperor of Shiling's clan. Unfortunately, he was still a little lacking compared to Mo Xiaoyao. "What orders does Prince have?" Su Zuodi said with a smile. Chapter 330. Jenim of Gojoseon looked at her with a smile that wasn't a smile. Since Long came here in such a hurry, I presume you already know that Mo Xiaoyao is in Suncreed City? Su Zuidi was slightly startled. Something flashed through her eyes, but it was quickly concealed by a charming smile. She lightly glanced at Jenim of Gojoseon and said, Long did know that Mo Xiaoyao was in Suncreed City, but when I found out, Long was already halfway there. Could it be that I couldn't have come here because I missed Prince? As expected, Prince still doesn't want to see Long Jenim of Gojoseon leisurely admired the peerless beauty's coquettish expression in front of him. With a faint smile, he reached out and pulled her into his embrace, laughing loudly as he said, How could I not miss Long Your Highness. The beauty softly clung onto the Zhenan Wang's body as if she was boneless, and called out in a sweet voice. Lei Tengfeng looked at the scene in front of him with an ugly expression. In the end, he couldn't help but coldly say, Father, if there's nothing else, this son will take his leave first. Jenim of Gojoseon let go of Su Zuidi. He looked at Lei Tengfeng and shook his head as he said, Child, you're good at everything, but you're just too serious about everything. The usual smile on Lei Tengfeng's face vanished without a trace. He cast a glance at Su Zuidi and said, Son, there's no need to be serious about a promiscuous woman. It's just that I find her disgusting. You. Lei Tengfeng, you're going too far. Su Zuidi was so angry that her face alternated between red and white. She turned to Jenim of Gojoseon, her eyes red with grievance as she said unwillingly, Prince, look at His Highness, he actually said that about me. Long really doesn't have the face to live anymore. That's enough, you two don't quarrel every time you see each other. Jenim of Gojoseon put away the smile on his face and said with a frown. Su Zuidi snorted softly and glared at Lei Tengfeng, but for some reason, she held back. Lei Tengfeng said, If there's nothing else, your son will leave first. Jenim of Gojoseon shook his head and said, Forget it, let's talk business. Long what plans do you have for Mo Xiaoyao? Su Zuidi's beautiful brows furrowed slightly, but she quickly raised her head and said with a charming smile, Does the prince want Long to go back and look for him? Jenim of Gojoseon smiled and said, Go back and look for him. Do you think he will still accept you now? Who in the world doesn't know that the Prince of Dinghua is deeply in love with Wang Fei? A trace of resentment flashed across Su Zuidi's eyes. She raised her head, but her eyes were still as charming as before. She said softly, Prince, do you not believe me? Long and Prince Ding grew up together. Could it be that I can't compare to Yili, that useless daughter? That Yili, other than having a good family background, what else does she have? No, she doesn't even have a good family background, she just has a good grandfather. It's a pity that Master Qingyun hasn't paid attention to worldly affairs for many years. She is Prince Ding's legitimate fiancée, De Chu states, #1 beauty in the world. Could it be that she can't compare to a woman with no talent and no looks? Lei Tengfeng snorted disdainfully, clearly expressing his meaning. Su Zuidi glared angrily at him. Jenim of Gojoseon smiled and said, How could that be? I absolutely believe that Long is a peerless beauty in the world. How could Mo Xiaoyao not be defeated and fall under Long skirt? Su Zuidi smiled at Lei Tengfeng with a bit of pride. What does the prince want me to do? Jenim of Gojoseon smiled and didn't say anything. Father, will Mo Xiaoyao take the bait? After Su Zuidi left the tent, Lei Tengfeng frowned and asked. Jenim of Gojoseon looked at him and asked, Do you think I will be infatuated with her? Lei Tengfeng shook his head. He naturally saw clearly that although his father had some connection with Su Zuidi, he definitely didn't have any true feelings for her. Jenim of Gojoseon smiled and said, Since I won't take the bait, then why would Mo Xiaoyao? Then father, isn't it too childish to let her seduce Mo Xiaoyao? If that woman had the ability to seduce Mo Xiaoyao, why would she appear in the Western Tomb? Jenim of Gojoseon smiled and said, Who said that I want her to seduce Mo Xiaoyao? With such a wonderful person like the princess consort of Dingwa, Bai Long is just a pretty but useless vase. Lei Tengfeng frowned, but quickly relaxed and looked up at Genom of Gojoseon and said, "Father has other plans. I just want her to distract Mo Xiuyao's attention for I. If she can't even do this well, then she's useless." Genom of Gojoseon smiled coldly, his voice cold and emotionless. There was no trace of the gentleness and love from before. In Xinyang City, Yi Li sat leisurely beside Mo Xiuyao, looking at a secret letter she had just received and raised her eyebrows with interest. Mo Xiuyao looked up and happened to see her interested expression. He couldn't help but ask curiously, "Is there any interesting news?" Yi Li passed the secret letter to him and said, "There's a nobleman from the Emperor of Shiling's palace. I'm afraid that he has already arrived at the West Hill barracks in 2 days." Mo Xiuyao frowned slightly. A nobleman from the palace? In the West Hill Palace, other than the Emperor of Shiling, the only noblemen who could be called noblemen were the concubines and princesses. After thinking for a moment, Mo Xiuyao asked, "Bai Long?" "Prince is wise." Yi Li was not stingy with her praise. Mo Xiuyao lowered his head and read the letter in his hand. He looked up at Yi Li and said, "I didn't know that Mr. Li had such a talent in the West Hill. It's not easy to find out news about the West Hill now. Ever since Han Mingyue went to the West Hill, the Prince Ding mansion could clearly feel that the Shadow Guard's actions in the West Hill were restricted everywhere. After all, Han Mingyue specialized in intelligence and had a good understanding of the Prince Ding mansion. Is an heir in the West Hill now?" Yi Li nodded and said, "Among Zhuo Jing and the others, an heir is the most suitable for intelligence." Su Zui, the news of Bai Long coming to the Dechu state was extremely secretive. He could find out in time, which means that the intelligence network in the West Hill has already achieved some success. But Yi Li couldn't help but frown when she thought of something. Her original intention of sending an heir to the West Hill was not to establish an intelligence network in the West Hill, but for the Biluo flower and the flaming lotus. Unfortunately, there was no news of the Biluo flower until now. As for the flaming lotus, she had to wait until June or July next year. Mo Xiuyao only needed to think for a moment to understand Yi Li's original intention of sending an heir to the West Hill. He patted the back of Yi Li's hand comfortingly and said softly, "Don't worry, I'll be fine." Yi Li smiled and nodded. It was useless to worry about a problem that couldn't be solved in a short time. Yi Li's lips curled into a strange smile. "Prince, do you think we'll be able to see the elegance of the first beauty this time?" Mo Xiuyao smiled somewhat helplessly. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "So what if we see it?" "So what if we don't see it?" Yi Li smiled and said, "Won't Prince have tender feelings for the fairer sex?" Mo Xiuyao looked at her with a smile, his eyes filled with endless tenderness and love. "In your husband's eyes, in this world, only my wife is a fragrant and beautiful jade." Yi Li couldn't help but twitch the corner of her mouth, throwing the free sweet words to the side. Because they had received the news earlier, when they finally met, they naturally wouldn't be as excited, happy, or angry as some people had imagined. Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao sat calmly in the flower pavilion, looking at the beautiful woman who had just been brought in. It had to be said that there was still a certain difference between the portrait and the real person. Even though Yi Li felt that the original portrait was beautiful enough, the woman in front of her was even more charming and moving than the beautiful woman in the portrait. Curling the corner of her lips slightly, Yi Li turned her head to look at Mo Xiuyao sitting next to her. As if their hearts were connected, Mo Xiuyao also turned his head to give her a faint smile. Yi Li twitched the corner of her mouth and turned her head. Only then did she adjust the expression on her face and gently smile at Su Zuidi. Imperial concubine Bai's words are too serious. This concubine and the prince are husband and wife, taking care of him is this concubine's duty. What's more, this concubine is young and doesn't know any better. Usually, It's the prince who takes care of this concubine more. There's no need to thank imperial concubine Bai, right? The smile on Su Zuidi's face froze. She raised her head and saw Yi Li's expression that wasn't a smile. She suddenly remembered Genom of Gojoseon's warning, the Ding prince's concubine isn't an easy person to deal with. If you look down on her, you'll only bring yourself big trouble. The Princess Ding in front of her was inferior to her in terms of appearance, temperament, and talent, but she was able to receive such praise from Genom of Gojoseon. This caused Su Zuidi to instinctively feel a sense of dissatisfaction and hostility. So from the beginning, she deliberately ignored Yi Li. When she realized that Mo Xiaoyao wouldn't pay attention to her, she turned her attention to Yi Li. However, a mere exchange of 2 sentences had rendered her speechless. Xiaoyao, how have you been these years? Realizing that the Ding prince's concubine wasn't as easy to deal with as she thought, Su Zuidi turned her gaze back to Mo Xiaoyao. Mo Xiaoyao slightly frowned and calmly drank his tea. Not bad. Why are you here? Su Zuidi gently bit her cherry lips, her watery eyes slightly red as she looked at him with grievance. Do you still hate me? I know you blame me. There were many times when I wanted to come back to see you and beg for your forgiveness. But I didn't dare. Sob. Before she finished speaking, pearl-like tears had already fallen. What a beautiful scene of weeping pear blossoms, it made one's heart sway uncontrollably. Unfortunately, the 2 people present weren't ordinary people. Yi Li resisted the itch in her throat and said, Imperial concubine Bai, our prince wants to ask you, why are you here? I snuck out. Su Zuidi quickly glanced at Mo Xiaoyao, a trace of red appearing on her beautiful face. I know that Xiling and the Dechu state are at war, and I also know that you, Xiaoyao, will definitely appear here. No matter what. I'm still a citizen of the Dechu state, I can't go back. If I'm caught, the Emperor and Genom of Gojoseon will definitely not let me go. Xiaoyao, I beg you, don't drive me away. Yi Li silently looked at the sky. She understood, this Su Zuidi wanted to play them like fools. Yi Li faintly raised her eyebrows. Since Su Zuidi liked to play, there was no harm in playing with her. Imperial concubine Bai, is young Master Mingyu in Xiling? Su Zuidi glanced at her, originally not wanting to answer. But she saw that Mo Xiaoyao was also looking at her at the same time, so she could only say softly, I haven't seen young Master Han in a long time.
Yi Li said, speaking of which. Han Mingyue betrayed the country and defected to the enemy, his crime deserves death. But this person is too cunning, this imperial concubine, and the prince can't find him for a while. I wonder if imperial concubine Bai can ask him to make a trip back to the Dechu state. Su Zuidi looked at Yi Li with some displeasure and frowned. I don't know where he is, I haven't seen him in a long time. Really, Xiaoyao, I won't lie to you. Mo Xiaoyao had no reaction to this. Yi Li said with a smile, it doesn't matter if you don't know, as long as imperial concubine Bai is here, there's no need to worry that young Master Mingyu won't come. Prince, don't you think so? Mo Xiaoyao nodded, what Li said is very true. I just so happen to have a debt to settle with Han Mingyue. Imperial concubine Bai will be handed over to Li. Hearing this, Su Zuidi was clearly deeply hurt. She clutched her chest and looked at Mo Xiaoyao in grief. Xiaoyao, you really still hate me. You want to use me to catch young Master Han. Yi Li leisurely admired her slender fingers, while smiling at Su Zuidi. Didn't imperial concubine Bai come here to beg our prince's forgiveness? Su Zuidi hesitated for a moment, but still nodded. Yi Li cheerfully clapped her hands and said, that's great, as long as imperial concubine Bai helps us catch young Master Mingyu, our prince will definitely believe in imperial concubine Bai's sincerity. Prince, don't you think so? Mo Xiaoyao looked at Yi Li with a gentle gaze, softly saying, Li is right. Obviously, Such a gentle Mo Xiaoyao made the hangover even harder to accept. Su Zuidi stared blankly at the two people in front of her, momentarily speechless. Yili didn't give her a chance to refuse, and said with a smile, "So Imperial Concubine Bai has agreed, that's great. Since that's the case, Imperial Concubine Bai can stay here with peace of mind. As long as you live in Suncrete City, this concubine guarantees that no matter if it's the Emperor Shiling or Genom King Gojoseon, not a single person will be able to touch Imperial Concubine Bai." Of course, it was even more impossible to pass on any information.
Chapter 332. Su Zuidi was only startled for a moment. This matter was decided in the midst of Yi Li's laughter and she couldn't refute it. Having achieved her goal, Yi Li was in a good mood. She called for someone to take Su Zuidi away to rest, and ordered people to ensure the safety of Imperial Concubine Bai. Seeing Su Zuidi leave unwillingly, the smile on Yi Li's face gradually faded. She frowned and said, "What does Genom of Gojoseon want?" Su Zuidi might be good at acting, but she definitely couldn't fool Mo Xiaoyao who knew her background. If she wanted to be a spy in Suncrete City, Su Zuidi clearly didn't qualify. Yi Li definitely had hundreds of ways to make her unable to pass even half a word to anyone. Mo Xiaoyao's face also darkened. Shiling Genom of Gojoseon definitely wouldn't use such a method that he knows is useless. Li, order people to pay attention to the movements in the Shiling barracks. Yi Li nodded. You're saying that Su Zuidi is just a chess piece to distract us, and that Genom of Gojoseon has other plans? Mo Xiaoyao nodded. If he wanted to spy Genom of Gojoseon, he wouldn't choose Su Zuidi. She was too eye-catching. If he wanted to use Su Zuidi to set up a honey trap, he would be at a disadvantage. I understand. I will send people to pay attention to the Shiling barracks and Genom of Gojoseon's movements. The governor's office in Suncrete City was the temporary headquarters of the Mahist army. All the main generals of the Mahist army, including Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao, were temporarily staying here. After that bloody massacre, Suncrete City, which originally had a population of several 100,000, had been reduced to less than a tenth. It could be said that almost all of Suncrete City were soldiers, and had entered into a militarized management. There were no pedestrians coming and going on the wide streets, no enthusiastic hawkers, only orderly and solemn soldiers. Even if some commoners passed by occasionally, their faces would be filled with sadness and stupefaction. Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao walked along Suncrete City's largest street, Black Tortoise Street. Looking at the empty streets, they couldn't help but sigh. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head and saw her sad expression. He silently reached out and held her hand. Yi Li raised her head and smiled at him. I'm fine. It's just that when I saw the #1 city in the northwest become empty, I suddenly felt a little disappointed. Mo Xiaoyao said softly, when this war is over, this place will prosper again in a few years. Yi Li shook her head and said, no matter how prosperous it is, those people are not the people who originally lived in this city. Mo Xiaoyao's eyes dimmed. When it comes to war, it's inevitable that ordinary people will be injured and killed. That's right, a general success is built on the bones of 10,000. Yi Li sighed softly. A general success is built on the bones of 10,000. Mo Xiaoyao was deep in thought. The Mo family's ancestors had outstanding military exploits that shocked the world. Wasn't the fame of the Mahist army also built on the blood and flesh of tens of thousands of people? The Ding Palace had always boasted of protecting the peace of the people of Dechu State. But when had he, including himself, ever truly felt sorry for the innocent people who had died in the war? Yi Li walked in front and looked back at Mo Xiaoyao with a faint smile. Her eyes held a nostalgia that he had never seen before. She slowly said, do you know? Someone once told me that a soldier's duty is to protect the country and the peace of the people. And the greatest shame of a soldier is to let the people they protect experience the most real war in front of their homes. Mo Xiaoyao was silent. The nostalgic expression of the Li in front of him made him feel that it was ethereal and distant. But it was so beautiful that it made him feel a faint pain in his heart. He suddenly felt that his heart was flustered and wanted to grab the person in front of him. It was as if he didn't do so, she would disappear in the next moment. Thus, he followed his heart and stretched out his hand to pull her into his embrace. His handsome chin supported the top of her head as he said in a deep voice, "This matter is indeed the shame of the Mahist army." Yili laughed softly and shook her head, saying, "That's not what I meant. Just treat it as me speaking nonsense. This matter is not your fault." Mo Xiaoyao gently said, "It's even more not your fault. Li, you've already done your best." Yili nodded. Just as she was about to stand up and leave Mo Xiaoyao's embrace, a pleasant voice filled with surprise and faint resentment came from behind. "Xiaoyao, you're here." The two turned their heads and saw the beautiful woman standing not too far away looking at Mo Xiaoyao with a face full of joy. Yili sighed in her heart. Su Zuidi was not only a beautiful woman. She was also a woman who knew how to use her advantages. Xinyang City was desolate. As a guest, she was clearly not liked by the prince and the princess. Naturally, no one would specially prepare beautiful clothes and accessories for her. But looking at the woman in front of her, she was only wearing the most ordinary white clothes, but it made her look like a fairy from the ninth heaven who had descended to the mortal world. Her black hair was casually draped over her shoulders, only loosely tied with a white ribbon. Su Zuidi was already 25 years old this year, but at this time, standing gracefully in the middle of the street, she looked only 2 years older than Yili, who was only 15 or 16 years old. "What are you doing here?" Mo Xiaoyao slightly frowned, looking at her with an indifferent expression. Su Zuidi's hands in her sleeves were tightly clenched. She shook her lips and looked at Mo Xiaoyao with grief in her voice. "You don't want to see me?" Mo Xiaoyao's expression did not change. His gaze was sharp as he stared at her and said in a low voice, "I ask you, what are you doing here?" Su Zuidi was startled. She gave a bitter laugh and looked at him with grief, saying, "I know, you still hate me. You still blame me for leaving you behind that year, right? But I was also forced to do so. Why can't you forgive me? You're still guarding against me like I'm an enemy. Can't I even come out to take a breather? If you hate me so much, why don't you just kill me?" Mo Xiaoyao frowned, no longer paying attention to Su Zuidi. He said to the empty street, "Men." 2 figures quickly appeared at the corner of the street, respectfully waiting for orders. Mo Xiaoyao pointed at Su Zuidi, who was covering her face and crying, and said coldly, "Take her back. If I see her come out again, you can go receive your punishment yourselves." This subordinate obeys. The two said in unison. Su Zuidi looked at Mo Xiaoyao in shock and said with a face full of disbelief, "You want to put me under house arrest? Xiaoyao, you're so ruthless. My grandfather will not allow you to treat me like this." Mo Xiaoyao said indifferently, "You want to let Elder Su know that you're still alive?" Su Zuidi was suddenly speechless. With her grandfather's temper, if he knew what she had done all these years, he would definitely kill her. She glanced at Mo Xiaoyao and Yili, who were still holding hands. Although Su Zuidi was unwilling, she couldn't follow the shadow guard back. If she was forcefully escorted back, it would be even more humiliating. Yili smiled at the resentful look Su Zuidi gave her before she left, and shrugged indifferently. No matter how beautiful a person is, you'll get used to it after seeing it too much. She had always thought that a true beauty should be just beautiful. Being too beautiful, sometimes, it's also a flaw. She accompanied Mo Xiaoyao to walk around the city to check on the various defenses. After comforting the lucky survivors in the city, the two returned to the governor's residence. As soon as they entered, Mo Xiaoyao was asked to leave by Feng Zhiyao. Yili also returned to the study to deal with the matters she needed to deal with. Chapter 333. Zhuo Jing and Lin Han had already put all kinds of information files and booklets on the desk. Seeing Yi Li come in, Lin Han and Zhuo Jing, who were still busy, quickly got up and bowed. Yi Li waved her hand to indicate that they didn't need to bow. The two of them then sat down and focused on the files in their hands. After 2 months of teaching, Zhuo Jing and Lin Han could basically meet Yi Li's requirements for the position of assistant. This was especially true for Zhuo Jing. As he had spent more time by Yi Li's side than Lin Han, he could understand Yi Li's intentions better. Most of the time, Zhuo Jing did not need to speak. Just by raising his hand, he could understand what she wanted. This freed Yi Li from her busy work every day. She only needed to pay attention to some of the more important matters that required her to make decisions. Is there any news from an heir? Yi Li sat down and asked as she picked up the booklets in her hands that needed to be dealt with. Lin Han got up and presented a booklet, saying, "This was received as soon as possible." An heir had someone send it back quickly. Yi Li took it and opened it. The booklet was densely filled with words. The contents were all related to Su Zuodi. It included Su Zuodi's current status in the West Hill, as well as the situation of the West Hill Bai family behind her. There were also many things about Su Zuodi in the palace, as well as her relationship with the Emperor of Xiling and the concubines and princesses in the palace. Yi Li was amazed when she saw the back. She didn't expect that Su Zuodi was not only the Emperor of Xiling's favorite concubine, but also said that she had a very ambiguous relationship with Genom of Gojoseon. Su Zuodi's relationship with the Emperor of Xiling's Bai family was very bad. She had almost been killed by the White Queen several times. It was all thanks to Genom of Gojoseon that the danger was averted. After that, Genom of Gojoseon directly suppressed the White Empress. Now, the White Empress was more like a puppet in the Xiling Palace. In the palace of the Emperor of Xiling, Su Zuodi had the final say. Yi Li was a little puzzled. Why would Su Zuodi, who could be said to have absolute power in the harem, come all the way back to the Dechu state? Wasn't she afraid that Mo Xiuyao would still hold a grudge against her for what happened all those years ago? Or was it because she was too confident in her looks that Mo Xiuyao would fall at her feet? After reading Su Zuodi's life story, which was more like an unofficial legend, Yi Li pursed her lips in boredom and said, "I'll send it to Prince when I have time later." Lin Han nodded. He put the booklet aside and prepared to send it to Prince after he was done with his work. Zuodi requests to see Third Miss Yi. Su Zuodi's soft voice came from outside the door. Yi Li frowned and thought for a while before saying, "Concubine Bai, please come in." Outside the door, Su Zuodi glanced angrily at the 2 guards at the door. She raised her eyebrows and said, "Can I go in now?" Unfortunately, the beauty's angry and charming appearance was like a stone puppet in the eyes of the 2 loyal guards. They said respectfully, "The princess invites concubine Bai in." Being addressed as noble consort Bai made her feel both angry and embarrassed. Everyone in the Mahist army knew that she was Mo Xiuyao's fiancée, but the people around Mo Xiuyao and Yi Li all called her concubine Bai. She couldn't help but wonder if they were deliberately mocking her. In fact, Su Zuodi thought too much. Most people in the Mahist army knew that Prince's former fiancée was the #1 beauty in the world, Su Zuodi, but they also knew that Su Zuodi was already dead. Even if she called herself Su Zuodi, as long as Prince didn't admit it, it wasn't true in the eyes of these people. Moreover, both the prince and the princess called her concubine Bai, so the subordinates naturally had to follow suit. With a soft snort, Su Zuodi stepped into the study. As soon as she entered the study, she saw Yi Li sitting behind the desk and looking at the booklet in her hand. Not far from the other side of the study, 2 tables were put together and were also piled with all kinds of books, booklets, and files. Lin Han and Zhuo Jing sat at the table, busy with the things in their hands. They didn't even look at the #1 beauty. It wasn't that they didn't like to look at the beauty, but this beauty kept bumping into Prince from time to time these days. Coincidentally, the prince was with the princess most of the time, and they were also with the princess most of the time. So it was inevitable that they saw the beauty more often. The world liked beauties because they were unattainable. If this beauty kept sticking to you and pestering you, no matter how beautiful the beauty was, it was inevitable that she would lose some of her luster. Looking at Yi Li's busy appearance, Su Zuodi's unwillingness grew even more. When she was still by Mo Xiuyao's side, not to mention helping with the affairs, Mo Xiuyao didn't even allow her to enter the study. But now, Yi Li was sitting in Mo Xiuyao's seat and handling the affairs of the Ding King's residence. The thing that she didn't get before was obtained by someone who was inferior to her. How could Su Zuodi be reconciled with such a gap? Miss Yi. Su Zuodi looked at the young woman who was still busy with her own affairs in an orderly manner and frowned unhappily. Don't you know how to treat guests at all? Yi Li raised her head and glanced at her, softly saying, there are many Miss Yi in this world, but there is only one Princess Ding. If Imperial Concubine Bai knows how to treat guests, this consort will naturally know how to treat guests. Imperial Concubine Bai, please take a seat and serve tea. Su Zuodi bit her cherry lips and confirmed that Yi Li really didn't put her in her eyes at all. She snorted softly and turned to sit down at the side. Not long after, someone brought tea and placed it in front of Su Zuodi before silently taking his leave. Yi Li wrote the last word on the booklet in her hand before putting down the brush and looking up at Su Zuodi. Imperial Concubine Bai, do you have something to discuss with this consort? Su Zuodi looked at Zhuo Jing and Lin Han who were sitting at the side and said, Zuodi has something to discuss with the princess in private. Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled, there's no need to be like this. The two of them are not only this consort's right-hand men, they are also loyal to the Ding Palace and the prince. No matter what Imperial Concubine Bai wants to say, there's no need to avoid them. Su Zuodi was very angry at Yi Li's stubbornness, but there was nothing she could do. Because Yi Li was obviously not interested in what she wanted to say. Helpless, Su Zuodi could only stare at Yi Li and say, does the princess not want to know my identity? Yi Li raised her eyebrows and smiled slightly at Lin Han. Lin Han, let Imperial Concubine Bai see the booklet just now. Lin Han responded and got up to deliver the booklet to Su Zuodi. Su Zuodi looked at Yi Li strangely before flipping open the booklet in her hand. The more she read, the paler her face became. The booklet clearly investigated everything she had done in Xiling all these years. After all, even if Su Zuodi changed her name in Xiling, it was not considered too conspicuous. But in the end, she was still the emperor of Xiling's most beloved concubine. How could she completely disappear in front of everyone's eyes? As long as they knew that Bai Long was Su Zuodi, it would be easy to investigate her background. Su Zuodi put down the booklet in her hand somewhat dispiritedly. She glanced at Yi Li who had a calm expression and felt even more embarrassed in her heart. These. Xiao Yao knows all these. Yi Li said, I was just about to send it to him in a while. I won't allow you to show it to him. Su Zuodi screamed. Zhuo Jing and Lin Han who were at the side frowned at the same time. Looking at the stunning beauty who had finally lost her composure, their eyes were even more disapproving. Their princess consort had never lost her composure and acted so disrespectfully. Chapter 334. Yi Li picked up the tea on the table and took a sip. The slightly bitter herbal tea made her frown slightly. She raised her eyes and asked in confusion, why? 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 In short, I won't allow you to show it to him. Su Zuodi said firmly. Yi Li said indifferently, Imperial Concubine Bai has misunderstood. What this concubine is saying is, why does Imperial Concubine Bai think that this concubine will listen to you? You. Su Zuodi's face turned green and white. After a while, she finally calmed down. She sat down again and even elegantly raised her hand to brush the white clothes on her body. She smiled sweetly at Yi Li and said, I know that the princess is jealous of me, right? That's right, after all, I grew up with Xiaoyao. Even if I was immature and left him in the past, now that I'm back, Xiaoyao will forgive me sooner or later. Are you scared? Yili silently glanced at Su Zuidi, then lowered her head and continued to look at the booklet on the table. Su Zuidi covered her mouth and chuckled, saying, Xiaoyao and I grew up together since we were young. He has never been willing to let me tire myself out to do anything. Seeing that you've worked so hard, when I reconcile with Xiaoyao in the future, I will leave you a place to stay. Yili rubbed the space between her eyebrows and looked at the woman in front of her who was happily directing and acting. She curled her lips and said, Go and invite the prince over. Tell him that imperial concubine Bai is suffering from hysteria. Zhuo Jing's expression twisted, then he quickly got up and dashed off. Mo Xiaoyao arrived very quickly. When he came in, Su Zuidi was staring at Yili in a daze. Su Zuidi now somewhat believed Genom of Gojoseon's words. Yili was definitely the most difficult woman to deal with in her life. Whether it was imperial concubine Lu who was almost on par with her in the Chu capital, or the former empress who almost killed her in the emperor of Shiling's palace, or even the current empress, they were all completely different from Yili. Su Zuidi boasted that she had seen many people in her life, but she had never seen a woman like Yili. Whether it was sowing discord or angering her, it was completely useless against her. It was as if she could not be angry or jealous at all. Facing her, Su Zuidi even felt like a clown. Xiaoyao. Seeing Mo Xiaoyao enter, Su Zuidi blinked and went up to greet him. Mo Xiaoyao stood at the door. His gaze swept over her and quickly landed on Yili, who was still sitting behind the desk. He asked softly, Li, what's wrong? Yili casually used her chin to point at Su Zuidi who was standing at the side and looking at Mo Xiaoyao pitifully. Mo Xiaoyao walked to Yili's side and sat down. Li, do as you see fit. I am in the middle of a discussion with General Lu and the others. Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled, saying, I don't dare. Imperial concubine Bai and the prince grew up together. No matter what, there is still some friendship between them. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows, saying, I was the second son of the Ding king when I was young. How could I grow up together with the young miss of the Bai family of West Hill? Yili narrowed her eyes at him, then imperial concubine Bai. Isn't imperial concubine Bai a captive that we caught? Speaking of which, letting a captive run around the residence is your dereliction of duty, Li, Mo Xiaoyao said with a smile. Xiaoyao, you treat me as a captive? Su Zuidi's body trembled, and she asked with a miserable expression. Mo Xiaoyao said lightly, you are the imperial concubine of West Hill, not a captive. Could it be that I colluded with the enemy, betrayed the country, and hid in the enemy's royal family? You are so cruel. Su Zuidi looked at the two people sitting side by side in front of her with a resentful expression, tears falling like rain. Mo Xiaoyao sneered and said indifferently, put away your appearance. It is a waste to use it on I thought that Han Mingyue had told you what I said. Or, you thought that I was joking. Su Zuidi trembled. That's right, Han Mingyue had said it. But she was too confident in her appearance, and always thought that it was because Mo Xiaoyao had not seen her for too long. As long as Mo Xiaoyao saw her in person, he would definitely forgive her. Mo Xiaoyao said with a smile, it's good that you showed up yourself. I was worried that there was no place to find Han Mingyue. Stay in the mansion obediently for the next few days. When Han Mingyue arrives, I will deal with you together. Su Zuidi was stunned for a moment, and then asked, in your eyes, am I not as important as Han Mingyue? Do you hate me so much that you won't forgive me no matter what? Mo Xiaoyao said, Han Mingyue is the head of the Tianyi Pavilion, and her spies are all over the world. What are you? This time, Su Zuidi really believed that Mo Xiaoyao did not care about her. Han Mingyue was the head of the Tianyi Pavilion, and whether as a friend or an enemy, she was someone that Mo Xiaoyao would not ignore. But what was she? The most beautiful woman in the world? If Mo Xiaoyao could really be captivated by her beauty, how could she be so cruel as to leave him in the first place? I love you. Su Zuodi murmured softly. No matter how many men she had, even she herself could not deny that the only one she could truly love was the man in front of her. Mo Xiaoyao glanced regretfully at Yi Li, who was sitting beside him with her chin propped up and watching the show. Yi Li had never said that she loved him. If these words were said by Yi Li. Just thinking about it, Mo Xiaoyao felt that his heart was filled with happiness and joy. The joy in his heart seemed to be about to burst out of his chest. Xiaoyao. Seeing that Mo Xiaoyao was lost in thought, Su Zuodi thought that he was wavering, and happily stepped forward to pull him. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes and did not even look at Su Zuodi's hand, saying, "Since Yi Li said that you have hysteria, go see a doctor. Zhuo Jing, invite the doctor to Imperial Concubine Bai's courtyard later." Zhuo Jing stood up and replied, "This subordinate obeys. Imperial Concubine Bai, please." Su Zuodi gritted her teeth and waved Zhuo Jing's hand away. She turned to glare at Mo Xiaoyao and said bitterly, "I know, you will never forgive me, will you? Since that is the case, I might as well just die like this." After saying that, she turned around and slammed her head against the pillar next to her. Zhuo Jing was standing just a step away from her, and he could have grabbed her with a raise of his hand. But she did not know what Zhuo Jing was thinking, and he put his hand back down before he could touch Su Zuodi's clothes. Thus, with a bang, a bloody mark was left on the pillar. Su Zuodi's body went limp and slowly slid to the ground, the blood on her forehead flowing down her cheeks. Su Zuodi looked up at Mo Xiaoyao, who was still sitting beside Yi Li, and said with gritted teeth, You are so cruel." Looking at the unconscious Su Zuodi, Yi Li sighed in her heart. If she did not know what kind of person Su Zuodi was, Yi Li would not be able to help but pity her. Su Zuodi was cruel to herself, but she was also very unlucky. She had miscalculated the degree of cruelty Mo Xiaoyao had towards her. How could the second in line to the throne of the Ding Kingdom, the current prince of the Ding Kingdom, be a kind person who would repay evil with good? Yi Li did not dare to say that she knew a lot about people like Mo Xiaoyao, but at least she knew a little about him. Love wants one to live, hate wants one to die. If she was Su Zuodi, she would never choose to appear in front of Mo Xiaoyao again in this lifetime. Mo Xiaoyao looked at her face that was stained with blood with some regret and sighed, "I don't know if she will be disfigured." Mo Xiaoyao looked at her with a smile, "Is Li Li worried about her?" Chapter 335. Yi Li glanced at him and said with a cold laugh, "No, this Fei is rejoicing in your misfortune." Mo Xiaoyao nodded and said in understanding, "I understand. Li is jealous. Li, do not worry. In I's eyes, other than Li, there is no other woman at this time." Yi Li snorted lightly and ignored Mo Xiaoyao. But from the slight curve of her lips, it was possible to see a hint of joy. Mo Xiaoyao sighed inside and pondered how to get Li Li to admit that she loved him. Lin Han and Zhuo Jing tactfully retreated to find people to bring the unconscious beauty back to her own courtyard for treatment. Wang Fei had no interest in paying attention to her, and the prince did not seem to be in the mood to pay attention to her. Even though the wound on her forehead did not appear to be life-threatening, but if she was unlucky, there would be one less beauty in the world. The courtyard that Su Zuodi was temporarily living in was a small and remote courtyard in the governor's fu. The governor's fu was not large compared to the residences of the Wang Fu and high officials in Jing. It was very spacious when the governor's family had lived there. But now, the governor of Xinyang City had disappeared. Not only did Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li move in, there was also Marquis Nan and the others, as well as most of the high-ranking generals stationed in Xinyang City. This way, Su Zuodi was able to be given a small courtyard in a remote corner of the inner courtyard. It was already preferential treatment. Waking up from her sleep, Su Zuodi reflexively touched her forehead. The thick gauze on her forehead and the clear pain caused her to feel both hate and regret. It was very much like Mo Xiuyao's heartlessness. She knew very well how powerful Mo Xiuyao's martial arts were. As long as Mo Xiuyao did not want her to die, she would not be able to hit the pillar. She regretted her impulsiveness. If she ruined her beauty because of this, thinking about this, Su Zuodi hurriedly got off the bed and leapt towards the bronze mirror on the table. This small courtyard was probably the residence of an unfavored concubine of the governor's residence. Although there was no lack of women's necessities, it was completely different from what Su Zuodi was used to. These items were not exquisite at all. Even the bronze mirror was blurry and indistinct. Su Zuodi stared for a long time, but all she could see was a blurry shadow on the bronze mirror and a thick white cloth wrapped around her forehead. In a moment of panic, Su Zuodi reached out to remove the white cloth on her head. Ah! Miss Bai, you can't undo it. The maid who was serving Su Zuodi came in from outside and just happened to see her actions. She hurriedly stepped forward to stop her. Impudent! After living like a princess for so many years, who dared to be so rude to her? Su Zuodi snapped. The maidservant was startled and hurriedly said, "The doctor said that young miss must not touch it before the injury is healed. It would be bad if it left a scar." Hearing the girl's words, Su Zuodi finally calmed down. She stared at her and asked, "You mean there won't be any scars on my face?" The maidservant hesitated, then nodded and said, "As long as Miss Bai recuperates well, it should not be." After receiving the maidservant's repeated affirmation, Su Zuodi finally relaxed. She sat in front of the bronze mirror and looked at her face in the blurry bronze mirror. She asked, "Who sent me back?" The little maidservant said, "It was Zhuo Darren and Lin Darren who sent people to send young Miss back." Su Zuodi's hand paused. "The prince did not come to see me." The maidservant looked at her strangely, but still respectfully replied, "Young miss, the prince did not come." Hearing Su Zuodi throw the comb in her hand onto the table with a clatter, the little maidservant cautiously took 2 steps back. She was originally a maidservant of the governor's residence. Although she had escaped in the chaos of the war, she had no home to return to. Fortunately, the Wang Fei was kind enough to let her stay in the Fu. She had been sent to serve this beautiful Miss Bai. She had been happy, after all, to be able to see such a beauty was a blessing. But after a few days, she felt that this Miss Bai was very strange. When she heard the Wang Fei call Miss Bai Guifei Bai, even though she didn't know which Guifei she was, she still respectfully called her. But she didn't expect Miss Bai to fly into a rage and insist that she call her Miss Su. But Zhuo Darren had said that the guest's surname was Bai. So she could only take a step back and call her Miss Bai. And Miss Bai always intimately mentioned the prince from time to time. Even though she was an ignorant maidservant, she could see that the prince's feelings for Miss Bai were not as warm as he was for the Wang Fei. "Damn it! I don't believe that you don't have me in your heart at all." Looking dazedly at the blurry face in the bronze mirror, Su Zuodi frowned in disgust and said, "Go get a better mirror." Very quickly, Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao didn't have the mind to pay attention to Su Zuodi's tantrum, because a shocking piece of news came from Jing. The emperor had thrown the entire southern Marquis Fu into the prison on the charge of southern Marquis and southern Marquis Shitzi for treason. The emperor had already sent people to the border to escort southern Marquis and southern Marquis Shitzi back to Jing. Hearing this news, southern Marquis instantly fell to the ground in shock. He couldn't say a word for a long time. After a long time, he gave a deep sigh. He had been low-key and cautious his entire life, but he hadn't thought that he still couldn't escape the emperor's suspicions and suspicions. Southern Marquis Shitzi stood and was about to charge out when he was stopped by Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao at the door. Yi Li asked, "Where is Shitzi going?" Southern Marquis Shitzi said, "It's all because of my southern Marquis Fu that has been implicated. I'm going to Jing to ask for forgiveness from the emperor." Before Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao could speak, Southern Marquis' angry voice came from inside the door, unfilial son. Come back here. Looking at the absent-minded Southern Marquis Shitsi, Yi Li sighed and said, let's go back first. Let's hear what the Marquis has to say. Shitsi was impulsive. Southern Marquis Shitsi forced a smile and said, what kind of Shitsi am right now? The emperor had thrown the entire Southern Marquis Fu into prison and removed Southern Marquis from his position as Marquis. Southern Marquis Shitsi was no longer Shitsi. Stepping into the reception pavilion, Southern Marquis came forward and cupped his hands, saying, Prince, Wang Fei, I've embarrassed myself. In the past month, Southern Marquis had suffered too many blows. He had been on a long journey and was tired. Even though Southern Marquis Shitsi had gotten better after returning, Southern Marquis Shitsi still looked weak. His originally gray hair was now almost completely white. Yi Li softly said, Marquis, take care. Southern Marquis shook his head and forced a smile, saying, since ancient times, accompanying the emperor is like accompanying a tiger. Even though I don't want to get involved, I can't avoid. Before he finished, he let out a long sigh. Mo Xiaoyao said in a low voice, I have implicated Marquis Shitsi. To say that Southern Marquis had colluded with the enemy and committed treason, let alone Mo Xiaoyao, even Mo Jingqi, who was sitting in the palace, wouldn't believe it. However, Southern Marquis Shitsi had been rescued by the Ding King Fu. In the emperor's eyes, the Southern Marquis Fu and the Ding King Fu were on the same side. Furthermore, all these years, Southern Marquis Shitsi had pretended to be deaf and mute, not helping the emperor deal with the Prince Ding mansion. To the emperor, this was a kind of disloyalty. At this time, the emperor would no longer trust the Southern Marquis Fu. Southern Marquis forced a smile and said, Prince, why do you say this? This Marquis is cowardly by nature and only wants to stay out of things. If it weren't for I'm afraid I wouldn't be willing to step into this mess. People who try in vain to benefit from both sides, today's retribution is reaping what they sowed. Chapter 336. Marquis, you don't have to belittle yourself like this. Mo Xiaoyao shook his head. When Marquis Nan was young, he also had a time when he was in high spirits. In the following years, the regent Mo Lufang died mysteriously and the previous emperor passed away suddenly. After that, Mo Xiuan also suddenly contracted a disease and tens of thousands of Mahist army perished at the border. Marquis Nan was a smart person. He saw things clearly and thought more. After seeing more and thinking more, he naturally became afraid. That was why Marquis Nan, who did not care about worldly affairs, appeared. Marquis Nan shook his head and did not speak. Yi Li frowned as she looked at Marquis Nan's gloomy face and his eyes were desolate. She was shocked. Marquis Nan probably had the will to die. Marquis, as long as you are alive, there is hope. Don't forget that the Nan Marquis estate is still waiting for Marquis Nan's rescue. The heir also needs Marquis Nan's guidance. I hope Marquis Nan will take care. Marquis Nan was startled. He looked at the Nan Marquis heir standing beside him and a determined expression flashed across his face. He said, this Marquis will return to the capital now. My son. I hope Prince and Princess can take care of him. Marquis Nan, please reconsider. Yi Li frowned. If Marquis Nan brought the Nan Marquis heir back to the capital, the result might be death, but there was still a chance of survival. But if he left the Nan Marquis heir in the army and returned to the capital alone, he might not be able to return. Marquis Nan raised his hand to stop Yi Li. He said, thank you Princess for your good intentions. But, the current emperor, this old man has watched him grow up. Compared to the prince and princess, this old man knows him better. Prince, the Ding royal estate has been loyal to the Dechu state for generations. I shouldn't have said this, but now, there is no difference. As for the emperor, Prince should make plans early. The parlor was silent for a moment. Marquis Nan had already made it clear that returning to the capital was a dead end, but he still wanted to go back. Nan Marquis Heir said in a low voice, "Father, I will go back with you." Marquis Nan glared at him. "Nonsense. If I don't return, do you want the Nan family line to end?" "Father." "Prince, there are people from the capital. They said they are escorting Marquis Nan and Marquis Nan's son back to the capital." The guard outside reported. Mo Xiaoyao stood up and sneered, "I just received the news and the people from the capital have already arrived. Your Majesty has improved. Who is the visitor?" The imperial bodyguard replied, "Replying to Your Majesty, it is the Minister of the Supreme Court, Wang Jingchuan." Mo Xiaoyao frowned. Wang Jingchuan. Prince Ding was busy with a myriad of affairs every day, naturally he would not have any impression of such a minor character. Marquis Nan smiled bitterly and said, "He is Wang Xiaorong's elder brother from the palace, the second legitimate son of the Wang family." Mo Xiaoyao frowned and understood. Although the southern Marquis estate was neutral, it didn't mean that they didn't have any enemies. It just so happened that the Wang family and the southern Marquis estate didn't get along. The emperor had sent such a person to escort Marquis Nan and his son back to the capital. His intention to make things difficult and humiliate them was self-evident. Mo Xiaoyao gave a light snort and said, "Let him in." Not long after, a young man dressed in the uniform of a third-rank official walked in. This person's appearance could be considered not bad, but there was an air of hostility between his brows that made people feel that he wasn't a good person. Behind him was a young man dressed in the uniform of a seventh-rank official. Yi Li looked at the person and raised an eyebrow. "This subject, Minister of the Supreme Court, Wang Jingchuan, greets the prince, Wang Jingchuan." Wang Jingchuan knew the severity of the situation. After entering, he immediately bowed to Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li. The young man behind him also bowed. "This subject, Minister of the Supreme Court, Zhou Yu, greets the prince, Wang Jingchuan." Mo Xiaoyao sat in his seat. He looked down at the two people on the ground and said lightly, "Rise." "Why has official Wang come?" Wang Jingchuan stood up. His eyes flashed with a trace of pride as he said, "Reporting to Prince, this official has come under the Emperor's orders to escort the traitors Nan Yi and Nan Junfei back to the capital." Mo Xiaoyao raised an eyebrow. "Traitors?" Marquis Nan is I's deputy commander. Although the Marquis Nan's heir was defeated and captured, he still returned safely. After that, he repeatedly performed meritorious service in battle. Who is the traitor official Wang is talking about? Where is the evidence? Wang Jingchuan clearly didn't expect Mo Xiaoyao to ask such a question. He was stunned for a moment before saying, "Prince, this is the emperor's intention. Could it be that Prince wants to defy the imperial decree?" Mo Xiaoyao sneered, "Defy the imperial decree? Where is the imperial decree? I heard that the Wang family and the Marquis estate have some grudges. I suspect that you are falsifying the imperial decree with the intention of harming the Marquis. Prince, please be careful with your words. Even if this official has a grudge with the Marquis estate, I wouldn't dare to do such a disgraceful thing. Where is the imperial decree?" Mo Xiaoyao asked faintly. Wang Jingchuan choked. Facing Mo Xiaoyao's aggressive gaze, he could only say, "The emperor gave an oral decree." Oral decree. Mo Xiaoyao looked at the uneasy man in front of him with a faint smile and didn't say anything else. Wang Jingchuan lowered his head and stood uneasily in the hall. The entire hall suddenly seemed abnormally quiet. Under Prince Ding's gaze, Wang Jingchuan felt as if he could hear the sound of his heart beating out of his chest. A large patch of the back of his clothes was silently drenched. Just as Wang Jingchuan thought that he would collapse under Prince Ding's pressure, Zhou Yu, who was standing behind him, walked out. He bowed to Mo Xiaoyao and said respectfully, "Prince, please calm your anger. This official is just following orders. I ask Prince to make things easier." Following orders? Mo Xiaoyao said with a playful smile. Wang Jingchuan clearly felt Prince Ding's gaze move away from him. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Wiping away the fine beads of sweat on his forehead, Wang Jingchuan was even grateful to this somewhat taciturn young subordinate of his. Mo Xiaoyao said with a smile, following orders. Originally, I shouldn't have made things difficult for you. However, I'm sure you've heard of a saying. Prince, please guide us. Wang Jingchuan wasn't an idiot. No matter how happy he was that the Marquis estate was unlucky, he didn't care. Since Prince Ding wasn't happy right now, he didn't need to show off his happiness. Of course, the Emperor would definitely stand on his side. However, if Prince Ding were to kill him in a fit of anger, the Emperor was far away and the Wang family wouldn't be able to hold their noses and accept it. Mo Xiaoyao looked at the two with a smile and said casually, when a general is away, the Emperor's orders are not to be followed. Wang Jingchuan paused and said with some difficulty, Prince, I have come under orders. Please don't make things difficult for me, Prince. Mo Xiaoyao looked at him with an indifferent expression. Wang Jingchuan felt bitter in his heart. He secretly regretted that he had wanted to see his sworn enemy fall and snatch this job. Not to mention that he was just a third-level official, even if it was the first-level Prince Ding, who would dare to say no if he wanted to make things difficult for him. However, if he couldn't bring the Marquis and his son back, his good days would probably come to an end when he returned to the capital. Right now, our army is at war with Xiling. Rashly removing the deputy commander will be detrimental to the army's morale. Official Wang, when you return to the capital, tell the Emperor this. If the Emperor blames you, Official Wang can push the blame to I. Mo Xiaoyao clearly had no interest in making things difficult for Wang Jingchuan and said indifferently. Wang Jingchuan shook his head and said, Prince, please forgive me. Marquis Nan's crime of treason cannot be forgiven. The Emperor is already furious. He ordered me to bring the Marquis and his son back to the capital within half a month. Otherwise, I can only take my head to see the Emperor. Prince, please be magnanimous and give me a way out. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and laughed coldly, what a crime of treason. This result, is it the Supreme Court's verdict or the result of the joint investigation of the various ministries? Where is the evidence? Before Wang Jingchuan could figure out how to answer, Zhou Yu, who was standing beside him, said, Prince, when the Emperor received the news, he was immediately furious. He ordered us to bring the Marquis back to the capital before interrogating him. Mo Xiaoyao snorted lightly. Without interrogating him and without even a decent piece of evidence, the Marquis Nan's entire family had been thrown into prison and executed. He snorted lightly and said, in that case, I was negligent. The Marquis Nan was right next to you, yet you didn't even notice that he was in cahoots with the enemy. Official Wang, why don't you bring a memorial to I asking for forgiveness? As for the Marquis Nan, once the war in the northwest is over, I will personally escort him back to the capital. Chapter 337. This. Wang Jingchuan hesitated with some unwillingness. Mo Xiaoyao said lightly, Official Wang doesn't trust one. Wang Jingchuan was shocked and quickly said, I don't dare. To tell you the truth, Prince. The Emperor has decreed that if Marquis Nan and his son don't return to the capital within 15 days, regardless of age or gender, the head of the Nan Marquis estate will fall. On the side, Yili sighed in her heart. The Emperor had made up his mind to kill the Nan Marquis estate. The lives of the Nan Marquis family members would be in danger before Nan Marquis returned. Even if they wanted to rush back to save them now, it would be too late. Most importantly, with the Prince Ding mansion's current position, it was impossible to secretly save them. If they wanted to ask the Emperor to spare them, they could only ask Mo Xiaoyao to personally return to the capital. But with the current war, it was even more impossible. Just as they were thinking, Nan Marquis suddenly walked out from the inner room and said calmly, I will follow you back to the capital. Wang Jingchuan looked at Mo Xiuyao. If Prince Ding didn't agree, even if Nan Marquis was willing to go with him, he wouldn't be able to take him away. Nan Marquis turned to Mo Xiuyao and bowed, Prince, I don't know when we'll meet again. Everything. I'll leave it to Prince. Mo Xiuyao was silent for a moment and sighed, I'm sorry, Marquis. Right now, he couldn't return to the capital to deal with this matter. Nan Marquis shook his head, it's fate. It has nothing to do with Prince. I will take my leave now. He turned to Wang Jingchuan and said, Official Wang, please. Wang Jingchuan looked at Marquis Nan, his eyes turned and he said, Marquis Nan, if this official remembers correctly, your son is also here. Marquis Nan smiled indifferently and said, This Marquis does not know what Sir is talking about. You. In front of Mo Xiuyao, Wang Jingchuan didn't dare to be too presumptuous. He took a deep breath and said to Mo Xiuyao, Since Prince won't interfere, I ask Prince to invite Nan Marquis heir out as well. I will also take my leave and return to the capital. Yi Li said indifferently, This consort has never seen the southern Marquis heir. Wang Jingchuan was stunned and frowned, Why is Wang Fei deceiving herself? Marquis Nan's son was captured by the West Hill and later rescued by the princess. How could Wang Fei not have seen him before? Yi Li smiled faintly and said, Lord Wang has just arrived from the capital, yet you know so much. You are truly well informed. However, Lord Wang's information might be a little off. This consort has indeed never met the southern Marquis heir. Or, does Lord Wang wish to search the governor's mansion and Suncreed City? Wang Jingchuan quickly glanced at Prince Ding, who sat beside him with a cold expression, and shook his head. Even if the southern Marquis Crown Prince was really in the governor's residence, he did not have the guts to search. Moreover, Suncreed City, the governor's mansion, and even the cities in the northwest were all under Prince Ding's control. Who could be sure that the southern Marquis heir was definitely here? If he could not find him and angered Prince Ding. Wang Jingchuan was once again certain that he had taken on a hot potato this time. Wang Fei is right. I have never seen the southern Marquis heir. Since you want to escort the southern Marquis back to the capital, I will not keep you. Also, since you are in a hurry, I will send 2 shadow guards to escort you back to the capital. Wang Jingchuan's heart trembled and he could only say, if that is the case, this humble subject will take his leave. Seeing the southern Marquis turn and leave without any reluctance, Yi Li sighed inwardly and stood up to send him off. Take care, Marquis. The southern Marquis' smile had a rare trace of carefreeness. He smiled and said, Many thanks, Wang Fei. Princess Prince, take care. After sending off the southern Marquis heir rushed out with a face full of tears. Zhuo Jing and Lin Han followed behind him, their faces full of helplessness. If they had not pulled the southern Marquis heir, they would have rushed out already. Seeing the southern Marquis heir rush out the door, Yi Li stood up and asked, Where are you going? The southern Marquis heir paused. Zhuo Jing and Lin Han had already blocked his path on the left and right. The southern Marquis heir turned his head and said, As a son and a husband, how can I watch my parents, wife, and children be wrongly imprisoned? Moreover, this matter started because of me. Yi Li walked in front of him and said indifferently, What's the use of rushing out now? Apart from one more person being thrown into prison and escorted to the execution grounds? Or do you want to go to the emperor to explain? Do you think the emperor will give you this opportunity? The southern Marquis heir painfully covered his face. How could he not understand what Yi Li was saying? But right now, he was going to accompany his father back to the capital. He was going to accompany his family and face this together. What else could he do? Southern Marquis, there may be a way out. Looking at them, Mo Xiuyao frowned slightly. The southern Marquis heir looked at Mo Xiuyao in surprise. Mo Xiuyao frowned and said, Duke Hua has the iron scroll that Emperor Gaozong bestowed upon the Hua family. Even the death penalty can be avoided. But the southern Marquis heir hesitated. He had heard of the Iron Scroll, but in this dynasty, only the Hua family, who had saved Emperor Gaozong's life, had been bestowed a copy. Even the Ding king's residence, which had protected the country for generations, did not have such a thing. But with such a valuable item, the Hua family. Mo Xiuyao lowered his eyes and said, Duke Hua will not be stingy with a dead object. I'm afraid. He was afraid that if Mo Jingqi was determined to take the southern marquis life, even if the Iron Scroll saved him, he would not be able to escape death. Yi Li clearly thought of Mo Xiuyao's concerns. She nodded slightly and said to Lin Han, send a letter to Mo Hua. Tell him to do his best to protect the southern marquis. The southern marquis heir gradually calmed down. He bowed to the two and said, Nan Junfei thanks the princess. Yi Li shook her head and said, Heir, there is no need to be so courteous. The southern marquis heir smiled bitterly and said, My name is Junfei. In the future, Prince, please call me by my name. I am no longer an heir. Princess, just now, Lord Zhou left a letter for you. The guard outside the door presented a sealed letter. Yi Li raised her brows. She took the letter and looked at it curiously. There was no problem. Lord Zhou. The guard nodded and said, Just now, before he left, Lord Zhou privately gave this letter to me. He asked me to pass it to Prince. Mo Xiuyao frowned and said, Does Yi Li know Zhou Yu? When Zhou Yu came in, Yi Li's expression showed a trace of surprise. Although it was fleeting, Mo Xiuyao, who had been paying attention to her, still saw it. Yi Li shook her head and said, He should be this year's Jinshi. We met once last year. Even if Yi Li's memory wasn't photographic, it wasn't too far off. As soon as Zhou Yu spoke, she remembered that it was the scholar who sold paintings at Shindexian last year. She did not expect that not only did he pass the Jinshi exam, he also became a registrar of the Supreme Court. Although his position was not high, it was a real vacancy. As long as his ability and luck were not too bad, he should have a good future. Opening the letter, Yi Li lowered her head to read it. Her expression immediately changed. She silently handed the letter to Mo Xiuyao. Mo Xiuyao looked at it and his originally unhappy expression immediately darkened. He slapped the table and stood up. He said sternly, Someone. Immediately chase after Marquis Nan. Kill anyone who dares to stop you. Zhuo Jing and Lin Han's expressions changed. They responded in unison and quickly walked out. Nan Junfei also knew that something had happened. His expression changed and he also followed Zhuo Jing and Lin Han out. Only Mo Xiuyao and Yi Li were left in the hall. The atmosphere became even heavier. Seeing Mo Xiuyao's dark expression, Yi Li did not say anything. She silently sat to the side and looked at him. After a long time, Mo Xiuyao seemed to have finally awakened from his extreme anger. There was a trace of tiredness and helplessness between his brows. Picking up the letter on the table again, Mo Xiuyao looked at Yi Li with a bitter smile and said, Li, I'm so tired. Yi Li silently leaned on his shoulder and gently patted him on the shoulder. Mo Xiuyao reached out a hand to hug the person sitting beside him. He absorbed the faint warmth from her body, but he was unable to resist the chill that rose from the bottom of his heart. Looking at the letter in his hand that was filled with familiar handwriting, was the Ding Palace really hated to such an extent? But the Emperor. Aren't you afraid that the Chu state will be destroyed? Chapter 338. The letter was not written by Zhou Yu. It was written by old Duke Hua. No one knew under what circumstances old Duke Hua could only find Zhou Yu, a minor official who had only been in the court for half a year, to deliver this letter. The situation mentioned in the letter was truly chilling. Mo Jingqi agreed to cede the land of the 3 states and 11 cities in the northwest to Xiling, and the condition was that they would cooperate with Xiling to eliminate the entire Mahist army. Mo Jingli and the Nanzhao kingdom in the south would also participate in this operation. In other words, it was very likely that Nanzhao had already sent their troops into Snow Pass. Mo Jingqi is crazy, Yili said softly. Gathering the strength of 3 countries to deal with the Mahist army might work. But did Mo Jingqi consider that once the Mahist army was eliminated, Xiling and Nanzhao would really retreat as promised? What was the difference between this and asking people to spit out the meat they ate? Mo Xiaoyao said in a low voice, he is indeed crazy. Li, you seem to have married a husband who is always troublesome. Yi Li smiled helplessly. It's too late to know now. Marquis Nan and the others returned quickly. When Zhuo Jing and Lin Han intercepted them, they had just left the city gate. In less than 15 minutes, they returned to the governor's manor. Wang Jingchuan's expression was ugly. He said in a low voice, Your Highness Prince Ding, what do you mean by this? Marquis Nan also looked at Mo Xiaoyao with confusion. But he also understood that Prince Ding would not stop them for no reason. Mo Xiaoyao stared coldly at Wang Jingchuan and asked mildly, Official Wang, is there anything you forgot to tell I? Hearing this, Wang Jingchuan's heart turned cold. For some reason, he suddenly felt that the calm and indifferent Prince Ding was more terrifying than the Prince Ding who deliberately released his aura. He forced a smile. Prince, what do you mean? Please forgive me for being dull. Mo Xiaoyao sneered. What a dull. I did not know that His Majesty would send such a dull person to the northwest. Since Lord Wang doesn't remember, I might as well remind Lord Wang. For example, he secretly executed Marquis Nan on the way back to the capital. Surely, Lord Wang wouldn't forget about it. Wang Jingchuan's eyes widened in shock. He had personally received this secret edict from the emperor just before he left the capital. It could be said that other than him, only the emperor knew. After receiving the imperial edict, he rushed to the northwest at top speed. Wang Jingchuan simply could not understand how the spies from the Ding King's residence were able to obtain such top-secret information even if they had the ability to reach the heavens. After hearing Mo Xiaoyao's words, the southern marquis froze for a moment before smiling bitterly. Nan Junfei, who was standing behind him, was so angry that his eyes were about to pop out of their sockets. If Lin Han hadn't held him back, he would have rushed over and torn Wang Jingchuan apart. Wang Jingchuan also knew that he had nowhere to run now that he had fallen into Prince Ding's hands. His body went soft, and he knelt on the ground. Prince, please forgive me. I was just following orders. I beg Prince to spare my life. Mo Xiaoyao didn't even bother to look at him. Yi Li waved her hand and said, Take him away. Wang Jingchuan was quickly dragged away by 2 guards. Yi Li then looked at Zhou Yu who was standing silently at the side. She smiled faintly and said, Lord Zhou, are you not afraid? Zhou Yu's expression was calm. He cupped his hands and said, I believe that Wang Fei is not someone who would kill the innocent. Yi Li smiled faintly and nodded. She said, I have to thank Lord Zhou for this. But Lord Zhou's actions. I'm afraid it will be difficult to explain after returning to the capital. Duke Hua had asked Zhou Yu to deliver the news of the emperor and Xiling's transaction, but the matter regarding the southern marquis was added in by Zhou Yu after he figured it out. Wang Jingchuan thought that the news was secretive, but he didn't know that Zhou Yu had been by his side for the past few days. From his usual actions and demeanor, Zhou Yu had deduced the emperor's punishment towards the southern marquis family. Zhou Yu was silent for a moment before saying, Last year, it was thanks to Wang Fei's help that I was able to gather enough silver in time to invite a physician to treat my mother. A few days ago, my mother died of old age. I was supposed to ask Ding Yu to observe mourning for my mother, but I was sent to follow official Wang to the northwest. It is clear that it was a coincidence that I was asked to repay Wang Fei's kindness. Right now, I am alone in this world and have nothing to worry about. Mo Xiaoyao was thoughtful. He nodded and said, if that is the case, is official Zhou willing to give up his scholarly title and temporarily stay in the northwest? Zhou Yu stilled. He wasn't afraid of death, but he didn't want to seek death. Prince Ding's actions clearly meant to protect him. Glancing at Yi Li, who was sitting at the side with a smile, Zhou Yu quickly made a decision. Many thanks to Prince for taking me in. What about the Southern Marquis and official Wang? Does Prince have any ideas? Yi Li asked with a smile. Mo Xiaoyao smiled and said, since Li is asking like this, she must have an idea. Yi Li smiled, the northwest is in the midst of war. The people of Xiling are everywhere. It is not surprising that official Wang's group encountered bandits or Xiling soldiers and was completely wiped out. What does Prince think? Mo Xiaoyao praised, Li is right. The Southern Marquis stepped forward and bowed in thanks, many thanks to Prince Wang Fei. Yi Li shook her head and said, Marquis can stay here without worry. But I will have to inconvenience you for a few days. The manner of the Southern Marquis. The Southern Marquis smiled sadly and said, let's leave it to the heavens. I only hope that when the Emperor hears that we have died, he will be merciful and let us go. After settling the Southern Marquis and his son, Lin Han received orders to arrange the scene of Wang Jingchuan's death. Although the Southern Marquis and his son and Zhou Yu were fake, at least Wang Jingchuan was the real deal. Lin Han was also an expert in disguise, personally trained by Yi Li. Naturally, he would not leave behind any flaws at the scene. However, the Southern Marquis and his son would have to conceal their identities for the time being. These matters could only be considered small matters now. Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao's attention was completely focused on the secret letter sent by Duke Hua. After receiving the news, even the usually indifferent Feng Zhiyao could not help but be enraged. He jumped up from his chair and was about to lead his troops back to the capital when Mo Xiaoyao stopped him. Feng Zhiyao said with a heavy expression, it has already come to this point. Prince still wants to protect Mo Jingqi. He still wants to protect the Chu state. Mo Jingqi doesn't even care about this country. Why should we interfere? Mo Xiaoyao's expression was indifferent. He said in a low voice, I never wanted to protect Mo Jingqi. The Mahist army also doesn't want to protect the Chu state's vast territory. It's the people living on this land. Feng San, if we break off relations with Mo Jingqi now and ignore Xiling, Nanzhao, and Beirong, the Chu state will be in chaos. Feng Zhiyao said coldly, then what should we do now? Even if we don't say anything, will Mo Jingqi just let it go? If we fight with Xiling, can Prince guarantee that he won't stab us in the back? Mo Xiaoyao was silent. He could not guarantee it. For Mo Jingqi to sign such an agreement with Xiling, it meant that he was already prepared to stab the Mahist army in the back at any time. But now, a pair of warm and soft hands gently held his. Mo Xiaoyao raised his head and met Yi Li's smiling eyes. Yi Li looked at Feng Zhiyao, who had never been so angry before. It's right not to announce it now. We don't have evidence. These years, Mo Jingqi has cultivated quite a lot of forces. The Mahist army only has 700,000 soldiers. Feng San, do you still remember how many soldiers the Chu state has? Chapter 339. Feng Zhiyao was startled. He gradually calmed down and thought for a moment before saying, more than 2 million. Also, Mo Jingqi is the emperor. He may have hidden armies that we don't know about. Yi Li nodded. Once we shed all pretense of cordiality, most of the time, the commoners will still believe the imperial family. Even if the commoners believe us, it will be beneficial in the long run, but it won't be beneficial in the short term. As for us, it is very likely that we will have to face more than 2 million soldiers. The Mahist army, no matter how brave they are, they won't be able to stand at the top of so many soldiers. Feng Zhiyao said unwillingly, are we just going to endure it? Yi Li shook her head. It's not that we're going to endure it. We need time. Feng Zhiyao was silent for a long time before saying in unison, I understand. But Princess Consort, I need to return to the capital. Mo Xiaoyao frowned. What can you do if you return to the capital? Feng Zhiyao smiled bitterly. Prince, even the shadow guard in the capital hasn't received this news yet. You and I both know where this news came from. I'm worried. Mo Xiaoyao said, you'll be more dangerous for her if you go back. Feng San, you've never been a patient person. Feng Zhiyao said dejectedly, that's right, all these years, if it wasn't for Prince stopping me, Mo Xiaoyao looked at him and raised his eyebrows. You blame me? Feng Zhiyao shook his head and smiled bitterly. No, I know, no matter what I do, she won't go with me. Prince saved both of our lives. Mo Xiaoyao said, don't worry and stay in the northwest. I promise that even if all the people in the capital are dead, she will still be alive. Feng Zhiyao suddenly raised his head, looking at Mo Xiaoyao. Prince has arranged for people. Mo Xiaoyao said, we grew up together. Besides, she has helped the Ding Kingdom a lot these years. How could I not care about her life and death? Feng Zhiyao's eyes flashed with relief. He sat down again. Thank you, Prince. Mo Xiaoyao said indifferently, I didn't do it for you. Feng Zhiyao smiled and said, I know. I thank Prince on my behalf. After appeasing Feng Zhiyao, Yi Li tapped her slender fingers and said thoughtfully, last time, we schemed against Lei Jinting. It seems that he is determined to get back at us this time. Mo Xiaoyao shook his head and said, whether or not there was the last time, Lei Jinting will deal with the Mahist army by hook or by crook. After the defeat that year, the Mahist army had long become a sore point for Shilin Genom of Gojoseon. This year, Genom of Gojoseon was almost 50 years old. For a general, it could be said that he was in the prime of his life. But if it dragged on, he would never have the chance to defeat the Mahist army and avenge the humiliation of that year. Yi Li looked at Mo Xiaoyao and said, I'm afraid that you will be very busy recently. Leave Xinyang to me. Mo Xiaoyao looked at Yi Li apologetically. They had only been married for a little more than a year. Even though he had always said that he would let Yi Li live the life she wanted. But in reality, from the day they were married, Yi Li had not had a single day of peace. Yi Li raised her eyebrows and smiled. The ones who fly away in the face of disaster are not people, but birds. Or does Prince not believe in my ability? Mo Xiaoyao smiled, admiring the confidence and pride in the person in front of him. He said softly, then, Xinyang's defense and political affairs will be handed over to Yi Li? Yi Li nodded. Don't worry, I will. Duke Hua's news was too sudden, but Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li both knew that Duke Hua would not make such a joke unless he was completely confident. Even though there were no movements yet, Mo Xiaoyao had to preemptively arrange the Mahist army's troops in order to deal with the possibility of multiple battles in the future. And in Xinyang, Mo Xiaoyao did not have much time to ask too many questions. After ordering people to send a copy of the maps drawn from the information gathered by Qi Lin to Mo Xiaoyao, Yi Li had people tidy up a new study and quickly moved in. Wang Fei, noble consort Bai, has been clamoring to see Prince. Yi Li was deep in thought as she stared at the map in front of her when Qin Feng came in and reported in a low voice. Right now, Yi Li was in charge of all affairs in Xinyang, including the tens of thousands of Mahist army soldiers guarding Xinyang city. Mo Xiaoyao was so busy every day that Yi Li had to deal with the matter of Su Zuodi alone. Yi Li frowned and said, if you did not mention it, I would have almost forgotten about her. Do you have any information on Han Mingyue's whereabouts? Qin Feng said, according to the news from Shilin, Han Mingyue has indeed left Shilin and entered Dechu State, but we have not found his whereabouts yet. Yili rubbed her forehead and said, as expected of Master Mingyue, who specializes in intelligence. I feel that he is near Xinyang. Qin Feng nodded in agreement and said, based on Han Mingyue's concern for Su Zuodi, it is very likely that he is near Xinyang. Unfortunately, Han Mingyue himself is an expert in concealing his whereabouts. As long as he does not show himself for a while, it will be very difficult for us to find his whereabouts. Yi Li's smile was extremely cold. If he has a weakness, then we don't have to worry about not being able to catch him. However, I am not in a hurry to catch Han Mingyue. Rather, it is the Tianyi Pavilion behind him. Although the Tianyi Pavilion's strongholds in Dechu State have already been eradicated by the prince, there are still many who have followed Han Mingxi in abandoning the dark for the light. However, it is inevitable that there will not be fish that have escaped the net. This kind of existence is a fatal threat to the current Mahist army. Qin Feng raised his eyes and asked curiously, what plans does Wang Fei have? Yi Li said indifferently, it will depend on Han Mingyue's feelings for Su Zuodi. Secretly have people spread the news that I am jealous of the old relationship between Su Zuodi and the prince, and have been making things difficult for her every day. I even plan to kill her behind the prince's back. Qin Feng was startled and asked with some hesitation, will Han Mingyue fall for it? Yi Li raised her eyes and revealed a faint smile. You think I am joking? Qin Feng did not understand. What does Wang Fei mean? Yi Li smiled and said, if Han Mingyue does not come, I will tear apart Su Zuodi and give it to him piece by piece. Those who seek glory and betray the country, die. This subordinate obeys. In a small town near Xinyang, Han Mingyue, who had not been seen for a long time, sat by the window in an inconspicuous house. His handsome face was filled with many vicissitudes of life and exhaustion, as well as deep worry. Young master. A gray-clothed man pushed open the door and entered, respectfully greeting him. Han Mingyue turned his head and asked, is there any news? The man nodded and said, Miss Su is indeed in the governor's office in Xinyang City, but our people are completely unable to get close to her. Han Mingyue was not surprised and said in a low voice, she has been placed under house arrest by Prince Ding. The gray-clothed man shook his head and said, Prince Ding does not seem to have any interest in Miss Su. Ever since Miss Su entered the governor's office, Prince Ding has basically not asked about her. Right now, all of the affairs in Xinyang City have been handed over to Princess Ding to handle. Han Mingyue was startled and turned to look at him. All of the affairs in Xinyang City have been handed over to Princess Ding. Then what is Prince Ding doing? The gray-clothed man frowned slightly and said, this subordinate suspects that Prince Ding has already found out about Genom of Gojoseon's plan and is very likely to have already made arrangements in secret. Otherwise, right now, there are still hundreds of thousands of soldiers stationed outside Xinyang City. Prince Ding would definitely personally take charge of the military affairs. Young master, this matter, should we report it to Genom of Gojoseon? You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.